Achlys, the goddess of eternal night. Picture this, a battlefield at twilight. The bronze armor of fallen warriors catches the dying light. Blood seeps into the parched earth. And in those final moments, as a soldier's vision begins to fade, something descends upon him. Not an arrow, not a blade, a mist, a clouding, a darkness that wraps around his eyes like a shroud, pulling him from this world into the next. The ancient Greeks had a word for this phenomenon. They called it Achlys, the death mist, the clouding of the eyes that comes just before the soul departs. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. This wasn't just a word. This wasn't merely a poetic description of dying. No, the Greeks believed this mist was a being, a goddess, perhaps the oldest goddess of all. Her name was Achlys, and according to some of the most ancient cosmogonies, she existed before everything. Before the gods, before the titans, before the earth and sky. Some whispered that she was there even before chaos himself, that swirling void from which all creation sprang. She was the eternal night, the first darkness, the primordial sorrow that predated existence itself. What does it mean for misery to have existed before the world? What does it tell us that the Greeks imagined sorrow as older than joy, suffering as more ancient than pleasure, and death's mist as eternal? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of Greek mythology's most haunting and least understood figures. We're talking about Achlys, the goddess of the death mist, the personification of misery, and according to Hesiod's chilling description, one of the most grotesque beings ever to appear in ancient literature. She's the goddess nobody wanted to talk about, the deity who received no temples, no prayers, no sacrifices. And yet, she may have been the most powerful of them all. Because while Zeus hurled thunderbolts and Athena won battles, Achlys simply waited. She was there at every death, every moment of suffering, every warrior's final breath on blood-soaked soil. She didn't need to fight for power because she was power itself, the inevitable darkness that comes for every living thing. So settle in, turn down the lights, because we're about to explore a goddess who embodied humanity's deepest fears, our most profound sorrows, and the one thing that unites every person who has ever lived: the certainty that one day, we too will feel that mist descending over our eyes. This is the story of Achlys, the goddess of eternal night. When we think about the beginning of the universe in Greek mythology, most of us picture chaos. That's what Hesiod tells us in his Theogony. After all, first came chaos, that yawning void, that gaping chasm of nothingness from which everything else emerged. Chaos was followed by Gaia, the earth herself, then Tartarus, the deep abyss, and Eros, the force of procreation and desire. This is the standard creation story, the one that's been passed down through countless retellings. But here's something that will make you pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew about Greek creation mythology. There were other, older traditions, whispered accounts, alternative cosmogonies that spoke of something that came before even chaos. And that something was Achlys. According to some of these ancient traditions, Achlys was the eternal night, not the night as we know it, not simply the absence of day, but something far more primal and absolute. She was the darkness that existed when there was nothing to be dark, the emptiness that predated even emptiness itself. Think about that for a moment. How can you have night when there's no day to contrast it with? How can you have darkness when light hasn't been invented yet? This is where Achlys becomes truly mind-bending. She represents a philosophical paradox, a being that shouldn't exist by the very rules of existence, and yet she does. Some scholars have suggested that Achlys represents the concept that negation, that absence, that void must come before presence. You can't have creation without first having the space for creation to occur. You can't have light without first having the potential for darkness to be dispelled. The Roman mythographer Hyginus, writing in the 1st century BC, presents us with an absolutely fascinating twist on this creation story. In his account, Achlys' Roman equivalent, Caligo, meaning dark fog or mist, wasn't just present before chaos. She was the mother of chaos. Yes, you read that right. The very void from which the Greeks said everything emerged was itself born from the dark mist that was Achlys. According to Hyginus, Caligo brought forth chaos from her misty essence, and then together they produced night, day, darkness, and ether, the bright upper air. This completely inverts the standard Hesiodic cosmogony. Instead of darkness emerging from chaos, chaos emerges from darkness. Instead of night being a product of the primordial void, the void itself is the offspring of primordial night. Now, we have to be careful here. Hyginus was writing centuries after Hesiod, and he was drawing on both Greek and Roman traditions, sometimes mixing them in ways that the original Greeks might not have recognized. His cosmogonies are, frankly, a bit of a hodgepodge. But the very fact that he felt comfortable presenting this alternative version tells us something important. It tells us that even in the ancient world, there were multiple competing narratives about how everything began, and Achlys figured in some of the oldest and most mysterious of these tales. What's particularly striking is how this positioning of Achlys speaks to something deep in human psychology. We fear the unknown. We fear the darkness. And what could be more unknown, more dark, than the state of non-being that preceded all beings? By placing Achlys at the very beginning, before even the concept of beginning had meaning, the ancient Greeks were giving form to the ultimate terror, the absolute mystery at the heart of existence. There's something almost Lovecraftian about this, isn't there? The idea that at the foundation of all reality lies not order, but misery, not light, but darkness, not hope, but the eternal night. It's a deeply unsettling cosmology, one that suggests that suffering isn't an unfortunate side effect of existence, but rather the bedrock upon which existence is built. Some versions of the myth describe Achlys as having no parents whatsoever. She simply was. She existed in a state of eternal being, or rather, eternal non-being. She wasn't born because birth requires creation, and creation requires time, and time didn't exist yet. She was outside of time, beyond time, the darkness that watches as time itself unfolds. This makes her fundamentally different from every other deity in the Greek pantheon. Even chaos, in the standard accounts, comes into being. There's a moment when chaos came to be, as Hesiod puts it. But Achlys, she never came to be. She always was. She is the eternal present tense of suffering, the continuous existence of sorrow, stretching backward and forward into infinity. The philosophical implications of this are staggering. If Achlys truly predated chaos, then she predated the very concept of order and disorder. She existed in a state that was neither organized nor chaotic because those categories hadn't been invented yet. She was the null state, the 0 point, the absolute nothing from which even nothingness emerges. And yet, she wasn't nothing. She was miserable. She was sorrowful. She was the death mist. This suggests something profound and disturbing about the nature of suffering in Greek thought. Suffering isn't contingent. It's not dependent on circumstances or events. It's fundamental. It's woven into the fabric of reality at such a deep level that it exists even when reality itself doesn't. When we talk about Achlys as the eternal night, we're not just talking about the absence of light. We're talking about the presence of darkness as an active force, as a thing unto itself. In ancient cosmology, darkness wasn't simply what you got when you turned off the light. Darkness was its own substance, its own reality. And Achlys was that substance given consciousness, given form, given being. The Greeks understood something that we often forget in our modern, well-lit world. Darkness has weight. It has texture. It has a presence. When you're in complete darkness, when you can't see your hand in front of your face, that darkness is almost tangible. You can feel it pressing against your eyes. And that's Achlys. That's the eternal night. Not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom at night, but the absolute, oppressive darkness of a world that has never known light, because light hasn't been created yet. This is why some ancient accounts placed her before chaos. Chaos might be the void, but Achlys is what fills that void. She is the substance of emptiness, the content of nothingness, the thing that exists in the gaps between existence. And here's the truly terrifying part. If she existed before everything else, then she'll exist after everything else too. When the stars burn out, when the gods themselves fade away, when even the memory of memory has dissolved into nothing, Achlys will still be there. The eternal night, the undying darkness, the mist that never clears. The Greeks didn't like to talk about her much. Can you blame them? Who wants to contemplate a deity who embodies the idea that at the very beginning and the very end of everything lies not hope, not love, not even chaos, but simple, eternal, unending misery? It's a bleak cosmology. It's a philosophy that offers no comfort, no solace, no promise of something better. But perhaps that's exactly why she's so important. Perhaps Achlys represents the Greeks' unflinching honesty about the nature of existence. They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't pretend that the universe was fundamentally benevolent or that suffering was somehow an illusion or a mistake. No, they looked into the abyss, and they saw Achlys looking back, and they said, yes, this is real. This is true. This is the foundation of everything. In some ways, Achlys is the most honest deity in the entire Greek pantheon. She makes no promises. She offers no false hope. She simply is what she is, the eternal night, the death mist, the sorrow that predates sorrow itself. And in her terrible honesty, in her absolute refusal to be anything other than what she is, there's a strange kind of integrity. So when we ask whether Achlys truly existed before chaos, we're really asking something much deeper. We're asking whether suffering is fundamental or contingent, whether darkness is primary or derivative, whether the void is empty or full of an ancient, terrible presence. The Greeks who placed Achlys at the beginning of all things were answering those questions in the starkest possible terms. And maybe, just maybe, they were onto something. Now we need to talk about what might be the most unsettling passage in all of Greek literature. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Hesiod's description of Achlys, found in the Shield of Heracles, is the stuff of nightmares. This isn't some beautiful goddess draped in flowing robes, isn't some regal figure radiating power and majesty. This is something else entirely. This is horror given form. The Shield of Heracles is an epic poem, traditionally attributed to Hesiod, though modern scholars debate this attribution. It dates from somewhere between the late 7th and mid-6th century BC. The poem describes a battle between the hero Heracles and Cycnus, a son of the war god Ares. But the real centerpiece of the poem, the part that everyone remembers, is the extended description of Heracles' shield. This shield is a masterwork of the god Hephaestus, and like the famous shield of Achilles in Homer's Iliad, it's covered with intricate scenes and figures. But unlike Achilles' shield, which depicts both war and peace, cities at feast and cities at siege, the shield of Heracles is almost unrelentingly dark. It shows battles, deaths, fates, and dooms. And standing among these figures of terror and destruction is Achlys. Let me read Hesiod's description, and I want you to really picture this in your mind. Close your eyes if you need to. Imagine you're a warrior facing Heracles in battle, and this is what you see emblazoned on his shield. Beside them stood Death Mist, gloomy and dread, pallid, parched, cowering in hunger, thick-kneed. Long claws were under her hands. From her nostrils flowed mucus. From her cheeks blood was dripping down onto the ground. She stood there, grinning dreadfully, and much dust, wet with tears, lay upon her shoulders. Take a moment to let that sink in. This is Achlys. This is the goddess of misery. And Hesiod spares us nothing in his description. Let's break this down piece by piece because every detail is significant, every element chosen deliberately to create maximum horror and revulsion. Pallid, parched. Her skin isn't just pale, it's the pale of death, of corpses drained of blood. It's the color of ash, of bone, of things that have been dead so long they've forgotten what life looked like. And parched, dried out, desiccated, like she's been wandering in a waterless desert for eternity. This isn't the healthy pallor of someone who just needs some sun. This is the pallor of death itself. Cowering in hunger, thick-kneed. This is particularly disturbing. Achlys is described as being hunched over, bent by starvation. Her knees are swollen, probably from malnutrition and the strain of supporting a starving body. But here's the thing, she's a goddess. She's immortal. She can't actually starve to death. So this is eternal hunger, never satisfied, never sated, just endless, gnawing emptiness. It's the perfect physical manifestation of misery, isn't it? That constant sense of lack, of need, of desperate wanting that can never be fulfilled. Long claws were under her hands. Not nails, not fingers, claws, like an animal, like a beast. This detail alone transforms Achlys from a pitiable figure into something predatory and dangerous. Those claws suggest that she's not just a victim of suffering, she's an agent of it. She reaches out with those long claws to rake at the living, to pull souls from dying bodies, to scratch and tear at the fabric of life itself. From her nostrils flowed mucus. This is deliberately disgusting. Ancient Greek art and literature rarely depicted gods in ways that were physically revolting, but here Hesiod doesn't flinch. Achlys has a constantly runny nose, mucus dripping down, probably crusting on her lips. It's a detail that makes her viscerally repulsive, that makes you want to turn away, to not look at her. And that's exactly the point. Suffering is ugly. Misery is repulsive. Death is disgusting. Hesiod isn't going to pretty it up for us. From her cheeks, blood was dripping down onto the ground. This might be the most disturbing detail of all. Blood flowing from her cheeks. Not from a wound, not from an injury, just blood, seeping from her skin, dripping down, never stopping, never clotting, never healing. Some scholars have suggested that this represents the tears of the suffering, tears so profound and endless that they've turned to blood. Others think it's the blood of those who've died, somehow marking Achlys herself. Either way, it creates an image of perpetual hemorrhaging, of a body that's constantly bleeding out but can never quite die. She stood there, grinning dreadfully. This is the detail that elevates the description from merely disturbing to truly terrifying. Despite all this suffering, despite the hunger and the blood and the mucus, Achlys is grinning. Not smiling, grinning. It's a rictus, a terrible grimace that could be pain, or could be malice, or could be some hideous combination of both. This grin suggests that Achlys takes a kind of pleasure in her role, that there's something almost gleeful in her misery. Or perhaps it's not pleasure at all, but rather the involuntary grimace of someone in so much agony that their face has frozen in this horrible expression. And much dust, wet with tears, lay upon her shoulders. The final touch, dust mixed with tears, accumulating on her shoulders. This suggests that Achlys has been weeping for so long that the tears have dried and turned to mud on her skin, building up in layers. It's the dust of ages, the sediment of eternity's sorrows. Those shoulders carry the weight of all suffering, all misery, all grief from the beginning of time. Now, why would Hephaestus put such a figure on Heracles' shield? Why would a hero want this grotesque image as part of his battle gear? The answer lies in the psychology of warfare. Heracles' shield isn't just defensive equipment, it's a weapon of terror. When an enemy warrior looked at that shield and saw Achlys in all her horror, he was meant to be paralyzed by fear. He was meant to see his own death reflected back at him, to see the misery that awaited him if he continued the fight. The shield was saying, "This is what death looks like. This is what awaits you. Do you really want to continue?" But there's something deeper going on here too. By placing Achlys on his shield, Heracles is acknowledging the reality of suffering and death. He's not pretending that war is glorious or that death is noble. He's looking it straight in the face and saying, "I know what you are. I've seen you, and I'm going to carry you into battle anyway." There's a kind of existential courage in that, a willingness to confront the absolute worst that existence has to offer and not flinch away. The placement of Achlys on the shield also tells us something about her role in the Greek conception of death. She wasn't the cause of death. The Charis and Thanatos handled that. She wasn't fate itself. That was the domain of the Moirai. No, Achlys was something else. She was the experience of dying, the subjective horror of that final transition. She was what it felt like when the mist descended over your eyes, when your vision clouded, when the world grew dim and distant. And Hesiod understood that this experience couldn't be beautiful. It couldn't be sanitized. It had to be shown in all its ugly, terrifying, revolting reality. So he gave us Achlys as she truly is, starving, bleeding, dripping, clawing, grinning. A goddess who embodies not just death, but the specific horror of dying, the particular agony of that moment when life lets go of you and you let go of life. There's also something profoundly sad about this description. Yes, Achlys is terrifying, but she's also pitiable. She's hunched over with hunger. Her knees are swollen. She's covered in her own blood and tears. In a way, she's as much a victim as an agent. She doesn't choose to be the death mist any more than mortals choose to die. She simply is what she is, trapped in her role for all eternity, forever suffering, forever hungry, forever bleeding. This dual nature, this combination of terror and pathos, is what makes Achlys such a complex and fascinating figure. She's not a villain in the traditional sense. She's not evil. She's just necessary. Someone has to be the death mist. Someone has to personify that final darkness. And Achlys is stuck with that job forever, wearing the physical marks of every death, every sorrow, every moment of suffering that has ever occurred. When Hesiod says that Achlys stood beside them, he's referring to the Moirai, the three fates, and the Charis, the spirits of violent death. This placement is significant. Achlys isn't wandering alone. She's part of a sisterhood of dark goddesses, each one representing a different aspect of mortality and doom. The fates determine when you'll die. The Charis execute that sentence. And Achlys? Achlys is there for the dying itself, the actual experience of transition, making sure that every death is marked by that characteristic mist, that clouding, that final darkness. It's worth noting that in all of Greek art and literature, there are very few depictions of Achlys outside of this description. Unlike other deities who appear on countless vases and frescoes, Achlys remains largely invisible. Perhaps she was too horrible to depict frequently. Perhaps people feared that representing her would somehow invoke her presence. Or perhaps she was simply too abstract, too closely tied to the internal, subjective experience of dying to be easily rendered in visual art. But Hesiod's description has endured. It has haunted readers for over 2,500 years. And it continues to shape our understanding of how the ancient Greeks conceived of death and suffering. They didn't shy away from it. They didn't romanticize it. They looked it in the eye, saw the blood dripping down its cheeks, saw the terrible grin, saw the claws and the hunger and the endless tears, and they named it Achlys. And in doing so, they gave form to something formless, name to something nameless, and created one of the most vivid and disturbing images in all of mythology. While Hesiod gave us a horrifying visual of Achlys, it's actually in Homer's works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that we really see the function of Achlys in action, even though Homer never personifies it as a goddess. Instead, Homer uses the word Achlys to describe a specific phenomenon that occurs during death, a mist or darkness that quite literally descends upon the eyes of the dying. The word itself, Achlys, appears multiple times in Homer's epics, always in the context of someone's death or near-death experience. And what's fascinating is how consistent the description is. It's always a mist. It's always shed upon the eyes. And it always marks that threshold moment between life and death. Let me give you one of the most famous examples from the Iliad. This is the death of Sarpedon, one of the Trojan allies and a son of Zeus. He's been struck by a spear, and Homer describes the moment like this. His spirit failed him, and down over his eyes a mist was shed. Howbeit he revived, and the breath of the north wind as it blew upon him made him live again after grievously wise he had breathed forth his spirit. Notice what happens here. The mist, the Achlys, descends over Sarpedon's eyes. His spirit fails. He's dying. But then something remarkable happens. The north wind revives him, blowing the mist away, and Sarpedon lives, at least temporarily. The mist isn't just poetic imagery. It's presented as a real, tangible thing that can be dispelled, that can be blown away like actual fog. This tells us something crucial about how the Greeks conceived of death. It wasn't an instantaneous switch from alive to dead. There was a threshold period, a liminal state, and that state was marked by the Achlys, the death mist. You could hover in that state, caught between worlds, with the mist over your eyes, but still tenuously connected to life. And in rare cases, like with Sarpedon here, you could even be pulled back from it. But most of the time, once the mist descended, there was no return. Here's another example from the Iliad, the death of Hypsenor, struck down by Eurypylus. He smote the son of Dolopion, Hypsenor, shepherd of the host, who was priest of Scamander and was honored by the people as a god. Even him did Eurypylus, glorious son of Euaemon, pursue, as he fled before him, and with his sword smote his shoulder, and sheared away the heavy arm. Then the bloody arm fell upon the earth, and over his eyes came dark death and mighty fate. Again, we see this image of darkness coming over the eyes. The phrase dark death in Greek is thanatos arabens, and it's closely related to Achlys. This dark death, this coming of darkness, is the signature of death itself. It's how you know someone has truly died. Their eyes cloud over. The mist descends. The darkness comes. In the Odyssey, we get a particularly vivid description during the slaughter of the suitors. Eurymachus, one of Penelope's suitors, is shot by Odysseus, and Homer tells us, "Let the sword fall from his hand to the ground, and writhing over the table he bowed and fell, and spilt upon the floor the two-handled cup. With his brow he beat the earth in agony of soul, and with both his feet he spurned and shook the chair, and a mist was shed over his eyes." The physical details here are brutal and realistic. The sword falling, the writhing, the spilled wine, the beating of the head against the ground. And then, as the final touch, the mist over the eyes. It's presented as the last thing that happens, the final sign that death has claimed another victim. What's particularly interesting about Homer's use of Achlys is that it's egalitarian. It doesn't matter if you're a great hero or a minor character, a king or a common soldier. When you die, the mist comes for your eyes. Achlys, or at least the phenomenon she represents, is the great equalizer. You might live gloriously or die ignominiously, but that final darkness, that clouding of vision, comes for everyone. This physical reality of the death mist would have been intimately familiar to Homer's original audience. They lived in a world without modern medicine, a world where death was a much more visible and present reality than it is for most of us today. They would have watched people die. They would have seen that glazing of the eyes, that loss of focus, that clouding that comes when the brain begins to shut down and vision fades. In modern medical terms, what Homer is describing is probably the loss of consciousness and the physiological changes that occur in the eyes as death approaches. The pupils may dilate or become fixed. The eyes may lose their focus. There might be a literal clouding of the cornea as the body's processes begin to fail. Homer is observing and recording a real phenomenon, but he's interpreting it through a mythological lens. To him and his audience, that mist wasn't just a biological process. It was Achlys. It was the death mist personified, a divine presence that marked the boundary between life and death. This understanding gives us a much richer appreciation for what Achlys represents as a goddess. She's not an abstract concept. She's a physical reality that everyone in the ancient world would have recognized and feared. When Hesiod describes her standing on Heracles' shield, when the cosmogonies place her before chaos itself, they're talking about something that every Greek person had either experienced themselves in near-death situations or had witnessed in others. There's also something deeply psychologically astute about personifying this phenomenon. Death is terrifying partly because it's unknowable. We can't really understand what it's like to die until we experience it, and by then it's too late to tell anyone about it. But by giving a name and form to that final darkness, to that mist that descends, the Greeks were making death slightly less terrifying. Not comfortable, not welcome, but at least knowable, at least categorizable. Achlys becomes a kind of threshold guardian. She's the last thing you see, or rather, the last thing that prevents you from seeing. When the Achlys descend over your eyes, you know you're crossing over. You're leaving the world of light and clarity and entering the realm of darkness and shadow. And in a strange way, that consistency might have been comforting. No matter how you died, whether in battle or in bed, whether as a hero or a coward, Achlys would be there. The death mist would come. There was a pattern to it, a reliability. Homer also uses Achlys in some interesting metaphorical ways. Sometimes it refers to the mist that gods cast over heroes to protect them or hide them. In Book 15 of the Iliad, Apollo spreads a mist over the Trojan ranks to protect them. This isn't the death mist exactly, but it's related. It's darkness as protection, obscurity as shield. This suggests that Achlys, as a concept, wasn't solely associated with death. It could also represent any kind of clouding, any kind of obscurity, any kind of veiling. But the primary association remains death. When Homer's audience heard the word Achlys, they thought of dying. They thought of that mist descending. They thought of the eyes clouding over. And if they believed in the goddess Achlys, they thought of her standing there beside each dying person, bringing her mist, marking that final transition. There's something almost tender about this understanding, despite the horror. Achlys doesn't kill. She doesn't torture. She doesn't torment. She just brings the mist. She just marks the moment. In a world full of violent, arbitrary death, there's something almost gentle about the idea that death itself has this consistent marker, this reliable sign. When the mist comes, you know, there's no uncertainty. There's no ambiguity. The Achlys is here, and with it comes the end. And in all of Homer's extensive works, in all the deaths he describes, and there are many, the pattern never varies. The mist always comes. The darkness always descends. The eyes always cloud. It's one of the few constants in the chaotic world of the Homeric epics. Heroes may triumph or fail. Cities may stand or fall. Fates may be challenged or accepted. But when someone dies, the Achlys comes for their eyes. This is the reality of Achlys. Not just a goddess in abstract terms, not just a figure on a shield, but a lived experience, a witnessed phenomenon, a part of the fabric of death itself as the ancient Greeks understood it. And perhaps most significantly, Homer never questions it. He never wonders why the mist comes. He never asks what it means. It simply is, just as Achlys simply is. Eternal, inevitable, undeniable. The death mist claimed every pair of eyes that ever closed in death's embrace. Now we need to address one of the most confusing aspects of Achlys' mythology, her parentage. Or more precisely, the question of whether she even has parents at all. Because depending on which source you consult, Achlys is either one of the most ancient beings in existence, predating even chaos, or she's the daughter of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night. These two accounts seem contradictory, but they actually tell us something fascinating about how Greek mythology worked and how the Greeks thought about time, origins, and divinity. Let's start with Nyx, because understanding her is crucial to understanding Achlys' possible relationship to her. Nyx is one of the primordial deities in Hesiod's theogony. She emerged from chaos early in creation, and she is, quite literally, the night itself. Not nighttime as a period of hours, but night as a fundamental force of the cosmos, as real and tangible as the earth or the sky. And Nyx was extraordinarily powerful. In fact, there's a famous moment in the Iliad where Zeus himself, the king of the gods, admits that he's afraid of Nyx. When Hypnos, the god of sleep, needs to escape Zeus's wrath, he flees to Nyx's protection, and Zeus backs off. Think about that for a moment. Zeus, who overthrew his father, who battles giants and monsters, who rules over gods and mortals alike, is afraid of night. That tells you something about just how primal and powerful these forces were. Nyx had many children, and they're a grim bunch. She gave birth, without a father, to a whole brood of dark deities. Thanatos, death; Hypnos, sleep; the Moirai, fates; Nemesis, vengeance; Eris, strife; the Charis, violent death; Moros, doom, and many others. Basically, if it's dark, unpleasant, or inevitable, it's probably one of Nyx's children. Some sources list Achlys among these children of Nyx. This would make sense, wouldn't it? Misery and the death mist certainly fit the profile of Nyx's offspring. If death is Nyx's son and the fates are her daughters, why not Achlys too? She'd be right at home in that family of doom and darkness. The problem is that other sources, as we've discussed, place Achlys before chaos, which would make her older than Nyx herself. So which is it? Is Achlys the mother of all darkness, existing before even the primordial void? Or is she just one more child of night, born into existence after the cosmos had already begun to take shape? Here's where we need to understand something important about Greek mythology. It's not a unified, consistent system. There was no single authoritative version of these stories. Different cities had different traditions. Different poets emphasized different aspects. What was true in Athens might be different from what was true in Sparta or Thebes. And these traditions could exist simultaneously without anyone feeling the need to reconcile them. So both things could be true, in a sense. In some traditions, some cosmogonies, some ways of understanding the universe, Achlys is the most ancient being, the eternal night that predates everything. In other traditions, she's a child of Nyx, born after the basic structure of the cosmos was already in place. These aren't necessarily contradictions so much as different perspectives on the same mystery. But there's another possibility, and it's a fascinating one. Perhaps Achlys and Nyx are, in some sense, the same being. Or rather, Perhaps Achlys is an aspect of Nyx, a particular manifestation of the darkness. Nyx is the totality of night, the complete expression of darkness in all its forms. Achlys might be one face of that darkness, specifically the darkness of death and misery. Think of it like this. Night can be many things. It can be peaceful, the gentle darkness that brings rest and sleep. It can be mysterious, the shadowy unknown that hides secrets. It can be romantic, the velvet darkness that brings lovers together. But it can also be terrifying, the absolute darkness in which things die alone and afraid. That last aspect, that face of night, might be Achlys. This would explain why some sources call her a child of Nyx, while others place her before everything. She's both separate from night and identical to it, both a distinct entity and an inseparable aspect of the same primordial force. She's what night becomes when it touches death, what darkness means when it signifies the end. There's a precedent for this kind of relationship in Greek mythology. The Erinnyes, or Furies, are sometimes said to be born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated him. But they're also sometimes described as being ancient beyond measure, existing before the Olympians, before the Titans, perhaps even before the Primordials. The contradiction doesn't bother the Greeks because they understand that when you're talking about forces this ancient and fundamental, normal concepts of parentage and chronology start to break down. Achlys might occupy a similar paradoxical space. She's old enough to have existed before chaos, but she's also young enough to be counted among Nyx's children. She's both mother and daughter to darkness, both creator and created. This isn't a logical contradiction so much as a mystery, a way of acknowledging that some things are too fundamental to be fully understood or explained. When we try to place Achlys on a family tree, we're imposing a structure that the original myths didn't necessarily have. The Greeks weren't always concerned with working out every detail of who begot whom. They were more interested in relationships, in functions, in what these deities meant and did. Achlys is related to night, clearly. Whether that relationship is mother-daughter, aspect-whole, or something else entirely might be less important than the simple fact of their connection. And that connection is clear. Both Nyx and Achlys are associated with darkness. Both are primal, powerful, feared. Both are connected to death and endings. In the great cosmic drama of Greek mythology, they're on the same side, so to speak. They're part of the dark family, the children and forces of shadow and ending. But there are differences too. Nyx is more than just death and misery. She also sleeps and dreams. She's the peaceful darkness of rest as much as the terrifying darkness of the tomb. She's neutral, in a sense, neither good nor evil, just a fundamental fact of existence. Every night, Nyx covers the world, and every morning, she retreats. She's cyclical, regular, predictable. Achlys, on the other hand, is unrelentingly grim. There's no positive aspect to the death mist. There's no comfort in misery. She's not cyclical but constant, not neutral but negative, not a natural rhythm but an ever-present drain. Where Nyx might bring rest and peace, Achlys brings only suffering and death. If they're related, Achlys is night's darkest aspect, the part of darkness that offers no comfort, no solace, no peace. Some scholars have suggested that the figure of Achlys might actually predate the more organized Greek mythological system. She might be a survivor from an earlier, darker set of beliefs, later incorporated into the Greek pantheon as a child of Nyx, because that's where she fit best. In this reading, those traditions that place her before chaos might be echoes of that earlier belief system, while her position as Nyx's daughter represents the later, more systematized version. It's also worth considering the psychological dimension here. Night and death, darkness and dying, are intimately connected in human experience. We fear the dark because we can't see threats. We associate night with danger, with vulnerability, with death. The connection between Nyx and Achlys, whether as mother and daughter or as whole and aspect, reflects this deep psychological link. When you're dying, when the Achlys descends over your eyes, what you're experiencing is a kind of night, isn't it? The final night, the eternal night, the darkness that doesn't lift with the dawn. So in that sense, Achlys is always a child of night, always born from darkness, always a manifestation of the ultimate shadow. But if Achlys existed before chaos, if she is the eternal night that predated creation, then she's not so much Nyx's daughter as her grandmother, her ancient ancestor, the original darkness from which all other darknesses descend. Nyx would be the organized, personified version of night as a natural phenomenon, while Achlys would be the primordial darkness, the you are shadow, the first and final dark. The truth, if we can even speak of truth in mythology, is probably somewhere in between, or perhaps in both places at once. Achlys is connected to night in a relationship that defies easy categorization. She's older and younger, mother and daughter, distinct and identical, all at the same time. She's the death mist, and that mist is as old as darkness and as young as every death that happens. She's eternal and momentary, ancient and ever new. What we can say with certainty is that whether she's Nyx's daughter or Nyx's ancestor, Achlys belongs to the darkness. She's part of that great family of shadow, that clan of night. And in the Greek imagination, that made her one of the most powerful and most feared beings in existence. Because the darkness always comes, the night always falls. And when it falls for the final time, when the darkness comes and doesn't leave, that darkness has a name and a face, however horrible that face might be. That name is Achlys. That darkness is hers. And whether she was born from Nyx or existed before all birth, before all existence, the end result is the same. She is there in every dying moment, bringing her mist, claiming each fading vision, marking the boundary between the light of life and the eternal shadow of death. If we accept the tradition that makes Achlys a daughter of Nyx, then she has sisters, terrifying sisters, a whole sisterhood of death and violence and doom. And perhaps none are more closely related to Achlys in function and nature than the Keris, those dark spirits of violent death who haunted Greek battlefields and brought destruction to mortals. The Keris, whose name comes from the Greek word meaning doom or death, were multiple entities, though sometimes the singular Ker is mentioned. They were death-bringers, specifically associated with violent, bloody death in battle. They were the ones who were actually killed, who swooped down onto battlefields to claim the souls of the dying, who drank the blood of the wounded and fed on the dead. In Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, the same poem that gives us that horrifying description of Achlys, the Keris are described right alongside her. They're shown gnashing their teeth, glaring with fierce eyes, fighting over dying men, eager to drink the dark blood. They're depicted with long, white fangs, with claws that tear at flesh, with an insatiable hunger for death. The relationship between Achlys and the Keris is complex and fascinating. They're clearly related, clearly part of the same dark family, clearly involved in the same business of death. But their roles are subtly different, and understanding that difference tells us something important about how the Greeks conceptualized the process of dying. The Keris are active agents. They cause death. They bring it about. On the battlefield, a Greek warrior might say that a Ker had claimed his companion, meaning that fate had decreed his death and the spirit had executed that decree. The Keris are hunters, predators, seekers of souls. They have agency, intention, desire. They want to kill. They want to feast on blood. They're hungry for death. Achlys, on the other hand, is more passive. She doesn't cause death so much as mark it. She doesn't hunt. She just appears. When the Achlys have done their work, when a warrior is breathing his last, that's when Achlys arrives with her mist. She's not the killer but the witness, not the cause but the symptom, not the hunt but the aftermath. Think of it this way. The Achlys are the violence that ends life. Achlys is the darkness that follows. The Achlys are the moment of death. Achlys is the experience of dying. The Achlys take your life. Achlys takes your vision. But despite these differences, Achlys and the Achlys are clearly connected. They appear together on Heracles' shield. They're part of the same iconography of death and doom. And in some accounts, they might even be the same beings viewed from different angles. There's a fascinating fluidity to how the ancient Greeks talked about these death spirits. Sometimes the Achlys are distinct entities with their own personalities and purposes. Sometimes they seem to be more like forces, abstract personifications of death's inevitability. And sometimes, in the chaos and confusion of battle, in the moment when blood is flowing and men are screaming and death is everywhere, all these distinctions might blur together. A warrior seeing his companion fall might not carefully distinguish between the cur that killed him, the Achlys that clouded his eyes, and the general miasma of death that hung over the battlefield. They're all part of the same terrible reality, all aspects of the same horrible transformation from living man to corpse. Both Achlys and the Achlys are depicted as female, which is significant. Death, in Greek mythology, is often feminized. Whether it's the gentle death personified by Thanatos or the violent death embodied by the Achlys, whether it's the death mist of Achlys or the thread cutting of the Moirai, there's often a feminine principle at work. This might reflect ancient associations between women and the mysteries of birth and death, between the feminine and the threshold states of existence. But these aren't nurturing feminine figures. These aren't mother goddesses or fertility spirits. The Achlys and Achlys represent the dark side of the feminine, the devouring rather than the nurturing, the taking away rather than the bringing forth. They're terrifying maternal figures, if you will, but what they birth is death itself. In terms of appearance, the Achlys and Achlys share several traits. Both are described as having dark, terrible aspects. Both are associated with blood, though in different ways. The Achlys thirst for it and drink it. Achlys weeps it from her cheeks. Both have something predatory about them. The Achlys have their claws and fangs. Achlys has her long claws under her hands. But where the Achlys are depicted as active and energetic, almost frenzied in their pursuit of death, Achlys seems more stationary, more passive, more enduring. The Achlys rush and fight and tear. Achlys stands, grinning her terrible grin, waiting. The Achlys are the storm of death. Achlys is its stillness. There's also a numerical difference that's worth noting. The Achlys are plural, a swarm, a multitude. There are many of them, enough to cover a battlefield, enough that they have to fight among themselves for victims. Achlys, on the other hand, is singular. There's only one death mist, one goddess of misery. She doesn't need to multiply because she's everywhere at once. Every dying person sees the same Achlys descending over their eyes. It's always her, singular and eternal. This singularity makes Achlys even more inescapable than the Achlys. You might hope to avoid the particular cur that's hunting you. You might fight well enough, be lucky enough, be favored enough by the gods that the Achlys pass you by. But you can't avoid Achlys. If you die, she'll be there. The mist will come. It's not a matter of if, but when. In some battle scenes in Greek literature, you can almost see the division of labor between these death spirits. The Achlys swoop in, causing chaos and slaughter, pulling souls from bodies, creating the carnage of war. And behind them, in their wake, comes Achlys, methodically claiming each dying vision, bringing her characteristic mist to every fading pair of eyes. The Achlys are the violence. Achlys is the conclusion. There's also an emotional dimension to consider. The Caris seem to take pleasure in their work. They're eager, hungry, aggressive. They want death to happen, and they make it happen with enthusiasm. Achlys, despite her terrible grin, seems more melancholy. Her hunger is described, but it's a starving hunger, not a satisfied one. She's covered in tears. She's suffering even as she brings suffering. The Caris are cruel. Achlys is tragic. This makes Achlys a more complex figure, doesn't it? She's both perpetrator and victim, both the bringer of misery and miserable herself, both terrifying and pitiable. The Caris, for all their horror, are straightforward. They're evil, if we can use that word. They're malevolent spirits doing malevolent work. But Achlys exists in a more ambiguous moral space. She's doing her job, fulfilling her function, but that function is also her curse, her eternal suffering. If we think of them as sisters, as daughters of the same primordial night, then they represent different aspects of their mother's darkness. The Caris are the darkness that kills. Achlys is the darkness that mourns. The Caris are at night as dangerous. Achlys is night as sorrow. Together, they make up the complete face of death, the full spectrum of mortality's horror. In the ancient Greek worldview, death wasn't a single, simple event. It was a process, a journey, a transformation with multiple stages and multiple divine presences involved. The more I might determine when you would die, the Caris might be the agents of that death, especially in battle. Thanatos might claim your soul. And through it all, Achlys would be there, bringing her mist, marking that threshold, ensuring that every death bore her signature darkness. This multiplicity of death spirits might seem redundant to us, but to the Greeks, it made perfect sense. Death is complicated. Death is multifaceted. Of course, it would take multiple divine beings to encompass all its aspects. And Achlys, whether as sister to the Caris or as a separate, more ancient entity, was an essential part of that multiplicity. What's particularly striking is that despite their shared presence on the battlefield, despite their common association with death, Achlys and the Caris never seem to interact in the surviving texts. They don't speak to each other. They don't fight over victims. They don't collaborate or compete. They simply coexist, each doing their separate but related work. This might reflect the way death actually works. The violence that kills you and the experience of dying are related but separate phenomena. They happen at the same time, but in different registers, so to speak. Your body experiences the violence. Your consciousness experiences the dying. The Caris are the body's death. Achlys is the consciousness's death. And both are inevitable. Both are inescapable. Both are, in their way, daughters of the eternal night, serving their mother's dark purpose, ensuring that no one escapes the darkness forever. The Caris might fail to kill you in any particular battle. You might survive, might live to fight another day. But eventually, whether from violence or age or disease, death will come. And when it does, even if the Caris aren't there, Achlys will be. The mist always descends. The eyes always cloud. The darkness always comes. That's the grim sisterhood of death spirits in Greek mythology. Active and passive, violent and sorrowful, multiple and singular. They together ensure that mortality remains what it has always been. Absolute, unavoidable, and marked by a final descent into darkness. A darkness with many names, many faces, many forms. But all of them are children of night. All of them sisters in shadow. All of them wait, with more or less patience, for every living thing to join them in the eternal dark. Now we need to cross the Mediterranean and examine what happened to Achlys when Greek mythology met Roman interpretation. Because in the Roman tradition, we encounter Caligo, a figure who might be the same as Achlys, or might be her Roman counterpart, or might be something else entirely. The relationship is murky, appropriately enough for a goddess of mist and fog. Caligo's name comes directly from the Latin word for mist, fog, or darkness. It's the same root that gives us modern words like caliginous, meaning dark or misty. So already we have that fundamental connection. Both Achlys and Caligo are essentially personifications of dark mist, of obscuring fog, of the haze that hides and confuses. But Caligo takes on a role in Roman cosmogony that's even more primordial than most accounts of Achlys. According to the Roman mythographer Hyginus, writing in the 1st century BC, Caligo was the very first entity. Not chaos, not even a void. Just Caligo, just the dark fog. Let me read you what Hyginus says. From mist came chaos. From chaos and mist came night, day, Erebus, and ether. Think about what this is saying. Before anything else, there was Caligo, the mist. And from this mist emerged chaos itself. This completely inverts the Greek cosmogony, where chaos comes first. Instead, chaos is born from the mist, a product of that primordial fog. It's a fascinating reinterpretation that places even more emphasis on the idea of obscurity, of things hidden and unclear, as the foundation of all existence. In this Roman view, reality begins with obscurity. The universe doesn't start with a void or an explosion or even a creative act. It starts with fog, with uncertainty, with things half seen and not fully understood. There's something almost epistemological about this, isn't there? It's suggesting that our inability to see clearly, to know completely, is fundamental to the nature of existence itself. Hyginus goes on to say that Caligo, having produced chaos, then mated with chaos to produce the next generation of primordial entities. This makes Caligo not just the first being, but the mother of everything that follows. She's the ultimate ancestor, the beginning of all lineages, the source from which all gods and all creation eventually descend. Now, is this Caligo the same being as the Greek Achlys? The answer is complicated. In terms of function and symbolism, there are clear parallels. Both are associated with dark mist. Both are connected to death and obscurity. Both are placed at or near the very beginning of existence. But there are also differences. Achlys, as we've seen, is specifically the death mist, the mist that comes over dying eyes. She's particularly associated with the moment of death, with suffering and misery. Caligo, on the other hand, seems to be a more general cosmic fog, the primordial obscurity from which everything emerges. She's not specifically associated with death in the same way. This might reflect differences between Greek and Roman religious thought. The Romans, in general, were less interested in the emotional and experiential aspects of mythology and more interested in its cosmological and structural dimensions. They wanted to know where things came from, how they were organized, what the hierarchy was. So a Greek goddess who embodied the horrible experience of dying becomes, in Roman hands, a cosmic principle of primordial obscurity. But there's another possibility. What if Caligo and Achlys are the same being at different stages or in different aspects? What if the primordial fog that preceded all creation and the death mist that comes over dying eyes are actually the same thing, the same force operating at different scales? This idea has a certain philosophical elegance. The mist that obscured everything before creation and the mist that obscures your vision as you die would be the same mist, the same darkness, the same fundamental inability to see clearly. At the cosmic level, Caligo/Achlys is the fog of unknowing from which reality emerges. At the individual level, she's the fog of unknowing into which each person dissolves at death. In this interpretation, Caligo isn't so much a replacement for Achlys as a fuller understanding of what Achlys is. She's not just the death mist of individual humans. She's the death mist of the cosmos itself, the obscurity that predates all clarity, the fog that both precedes and follows all-seeing. There's also a practical reason why the Romans might have emphasized Caligo's cosmogonic role rather than her death aspect. Roman religion was, in many ways, more optimistic and civic-minded than Greek religion. The Romans were builders, organizers, creators of empire and law. A mythology that placed death and misery at the very beginning of everything might have been too bleak for their taste. But a mythology that placed a creative, generative mist at the beginning? That works better. That fog from which chaos emerges can be seen almost as potential as the raw material of creation. Hyginus's cosmogony, with Caligo at its start, actually has a kind of evolutionary logic to it. First, there's undifferentiated fog. From that fog emerges chaos, which is at least a kind of something rather than nothing. From the interaction of fog and chaos emerge night and day, darkness and light, the first real distinctions and differentiations. It's almost like watching order emerge from disorder, clarity from obscurity, structure from fog. But that more positive interpretation coexists with the darker one, because that primordial fog is also the death mist. That obscurity from which everything emerges is also the obscurity into which everything returns. Caligo gives birth to chaos, yes, but she also claims every dying vision. She's both mother and grave, both origin and ending. This dual nature makes her an extraordinarily powerful figure in Roman cosmology. She's not just one goddess among many. She's the foundational principle, the starting point, the alpha and potentially the omega of all existence. Every other deity, every other force, every other aspect of reality ultimately traces back to her, to that original fog. Some scholars have suggested that Hyginus was drawing on very ancient, pre-Greek traditions when he placed Caligo at the beginning of his cosmogony. There might have been older Mediterranean beliefs, perhaps from Etruscan or other Italian sources, that gave primacy to mist and fog as cosmological principles. In the mountainous Italian landscape, fog and mist were daily realities, obscuring valleys, hiding peaks, transforming the familiar into the strange. It would make sense for a culture living in such an environment to give mist a central cosmological role. When Rome conquered Greece and absorbed Greek mythology, the Romans engaged in a complex process of interpretation and adaptation. Greek gods were mapped onto Roman gods, though not always neatly. Stories were retold with Roman emphases and values, and cosmogonies were reinterpreted through Roman lenses. Caligo might represent one outcome of this process. The Greeks had Achlys, the horrible death mist. The Romans took that concept and, seeing in it something more fundamental, elevated it to the very beginning of creation. They stripped away some of the emotional horror, the bleeding cheeks, and the starving hunger, and focused on the core concept, primordial obscurity. But they couldn't completely escape the darker associations. Even in Hyginus's relatively abstract cosmogony, there's something ominous about starting with Caligo. Fog isn't neutral. Mist isn't friendly. They hide things. They are obscure. They are confused. A universe that begins with fog is a universe where uncertainty and obscurity are baked into the very foundations of reality. And that brings us back to Achlys. Whether or not Caligo and Achlys are the same being, they share a fundamental nature. They're both about not seeing, about darkness, about the limits of vision and knowledge. Achlys brings that obscurity to dying eyes. Caligo is that obscurity at the cosmic level. One is personal, the other universal. But they're two expressions of the same basic principle. What's particularly fascinating is how this Roman interpretation actually deepens our understanding of the Greek Achlys. If we accept the connection, if we see Caligo as another face of Achlys, then we have to reconsider what it means that Achlys existed before chaos in some Greek accounts. It's not just that she's old. She represents a fundamental principle of existence, the obscurity that precedes clarity, the fog from which all form emerges, the mist to which all form returns. When a Greek warrior died with the Achlys descending over his eyes, he wasn't just experiencing a personal, individual death. He was, in a sense, returning to the primordial state. The fog that covered his eyes was the same fog that covered everything before the cosmos began to take shape. He was going back to the beginning, to the source, to Caligo/Achlys herself. This gives a kind of terrible symmetry to existence. We emerge from obscurity, from that fog of pre-existence where we don't yet have form or consciousness or sight. We live in a brief period of clarity, of sight, of knowing. And then we return to obscurity, to the fog, to Achlys/Caligo. We're born from the mist and we die into the mist, and the mist is always there, before and after, the one constant in a universe of change. The Roman Caligo and the Greek Achlys, whether the same being or closely related counterparts, together paint a picture of reality that's both cosmically vast and intimately personal. On the one hand, we have this immense, primordial fog from which entire universes emerge. On the other, we have the mist that descends over one person's eyes in one moment of dying. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, terribly, they're the same thing. That's the power and the mystery of these primordial deities. They operate at every scale simultaneously. They're as big as creation and as small as a single human breath fading into nothing. They're eternal and momentary, cosmic and intimate, abstract and viscerally real. Caligo emerging from the fog to give birth to chaos, and the dying Greek warrior feeling the Achlys descend over his eyes are, in the end, experiencing the same reality, the same darkness, the same mist. The same goddess, whether we call her Caligo or Achlys, standing at the beginning and the ending, the mother and the grave, the fog from which we come and to which we return. Now we turn to another, quite different aspect of Achlys that appears in later Greek literature. In the epic poem Dionysiaca by the poet Nonnus, written in the 5th century AD, we encounter a version of Achlys that's less cosmic and more witch-like, less abstract and more actively malevolent. This is Achlys as the goddess of deadly poisons, and the story Nonnus tells is absolutely chilling. Nonnus was writing very late in the classical period, and his Dionysiaca is a massive, sprawling epic that tells the story of Dionysus, the god of wine, and his conquest of India. It's full of bizarre episodes, elaborate descriptions, and interpretations of myths that don't appear anywhere else. The section involving Achlys is one of the strangest. According to Nonnus, Hera, the queen of the gods, wanted to destroy Dionysus while he was still an infant. This makes sense in the context of Dionysus's mythology. He was the son of Zeus, an immortal woman, Semele, which meant Hera hated him with the particular venom she reserved for all of her husband's illegitimate children. But Dionysus was being guarded, hidden away in a secret place, protected by divine guardians. So Hera needed something special, something deadly, something that could overcome even divine protection. And for this, she turned to Achlys. Nonnus describes Achlys dwelling in a deeply shadowed cavern, a place where no light penetrates. This is consistent with her nature as a goddess of darkness and misery, but the cavern itself is described in terms that make it sound less like a divine dwelling and more like a witch's lair. It's damp, cold, filled with shadows that seem to move on their own. Hera comes to this cavern and makes her request. She wants Achlys to create poisonous flowers. Not just any poison, but something specifically designed to destroy the guardians of the infant Dionysus. These guardians were nymphs called lampads, torch-bearing attendants of the goddess Hecate. To get to Dionysus, Hera first had to eliminate them, and Achlys delivers. She creates deadly poisonous flowers, blooms that are beautiful to look at but fatal to touch or smell. Nonnus describes them in vivid, horrifying detail, flowers that wept with poison, that exuded death from their petals, that could kill with a mere whiff of their perfume. Hera takes these flowers and places them along the paths where the lampads walk. The unsuspecting nymphs, seeing beautiful blooms, reach out to touch them or bend down to smell them, and immediately they're struck down. The poison works quickly, devastating their divine forms, twisting them in agony before they die. This portrayal of Achlys is fascinatingly different from what we've seen before. She's not a passive presence here. She's not just the mist that descends during death. She's actively creating death, deliberately crafting instruments of murder. She's taken on the role of poisoner, magical herbalist, and deadly witch. The flowers themselves are interesting. Flowers are typically associated with life, growth, beauty, and renewal. They bloom in spring. They attract bees and butterflies. They're gifts given to lovers. But Achlys' flowers invert all of that. They're death masquerading as life, ugliness hiding behind beauty, ending disguised as beginning. They're the perfect weapons for a goddess of misery because they deceive. They promise beauty and deliver death. There's something deeply appropriate about Achlys being associated with poison. Poison, after all, is invisible death. It's death that comes hidden, death that sneaks in under the guise of nourishment or pleasure. When you drink poison, you think you're drinking wine or water or medicine. When you smell Achlys' flowers, you think you're experiencing beauty. But it's all deception, all misdirection, all death wearing a mask. And poison brings a particular kind of death, doesn't it? It's not the clean death of a blade or the quick death of an arrow. Poison causes suffering. It causes pain, convulsions, and agony. The victim knows they're dying, feels themselves dying, experiences every horrible moment of the process. This aligns perfectly with Achlys as the goddess of misery. Her poisons don't grant a merciful, quick death. They grant suffering, prolonged and intense, before the final darkness descends. Nonnus' portrayal also connects Achlys to another tradition in Greek mythology, the association between death goddesses and toxic substances. Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, was also associated with poisons and deadly plants. The sorceress Medea, Hecate's priestess, was famous for her knowledge of poisonous herbs. Circe, another famous witch, transformed Odysseus's men with drugs and potions. There's a whole lineage of dangerous feminine figures who work with deadly substances. By placing Achlys in this tradition, Nonnus is doing something interesting. He's taking this ancient, primordial death mist goddess and giving her a role in what we might call practical magic. She's not just an abstract force anymore. She's a being who can be approached, who can be petitioned, who can create specific things for specific purposes. She's become, in a sense, more like a witch than a cosmic principle. This more active, more anthropomorphic version of Achlys might reflect the changing nature of Greek religion in the late Roman period. By Nonnus' time, the 5th century AD, Christianity was already dominant in much of the Mediterranean world. The old gods were fading, and the stories about them were becoming more fantastical, more removed from active religious practice. Writers like Nonnus had more freedom to reimagine these figures, to give them new roles and new characteristics. But even in this later, more elaborate version, core aspects of Achlys remain consistent. She still dwells in darkness. She's still associated with death and suffering. She's still fundamentally a goddess of misery. The poisonous flowers are just a new expression of her essential nature. She brings death, and she brings it in the most painful, miserable way possible. The collaboration between Hera and Achlys is also telling. Hera, in Greek mythology, is often portrayed as cruel and vindictive, particularly toward her husband's lovers and illegitimate children. But even Hera doesn't usually get her hands dirty with actual murder. She schemes, she tricks, she manipulates, but she rarely kills directly. For this particularly nasty piece of business, the murder of innocent nymphs, she needs to call on someone darker, someone more intimately connected to death itself. And Achlys answers. She doesn't question Hera's motives. She doesn't hesitate. She simply does what she does. Creates death, manufactures misery, provides the tools for suffering. It's her nature. It's her function. You can't ask a fire not to burn, and you can't ask Achlys not to bring death. The fact that Hera has to go to Achlys' cavern is significant too. Achlys doesn't come to Olympus. She doesn't attend the assemblies of the gods. She stays in her shadowed place, her realm of darkness. And if you want her services, you have to go to her. This reinforces her outsider status. She's not part of the Olympian family, not part of their civilization and politics. She's something older, darker, separate. There's also a transactional quality to the encounter. Hera comes with a request, and Achlys fulfills it. It's almost businesslike, which is strange for divine interactions in Greek mythology. Usually when gods interact, there's all sorts of relationship complexity, history, alliance, and rivalry. But Hera and Achlys seem to simply make an exchange, request and fulfillment, no emotion, no complication. Death is Achlys' business, and business is conducted efficiently. The poisonous flowers also raise an interesting question about Achlys' domain. Is she specifically the goddess of poisonous plants? Or is this just one manifestation of her broader association with death and misery? The text isn't entirely clear, but it seems like the latter. Achlys isn't a nature goddess. She's not a deity of plants, poisonous or otherwise. But when asked to create deadly poisons, she can, because death in all its forms is within her purview. This suggests a kind of omnidirectional deadliness to Achlys. She's the mist that clouds dying eyes, yes. But she's also, apparently, the poison in deadly flowers. She might also be the disease that wastes the body, the wound that festers and won't heal, the hunger that leads to starvation. Any way that suffering and death can manifest, Achlys is somehow involved, somehow present. It's worth noting that this story doesn't appear anywhere in earlier Greek literature. It seems to be Nonnus' invention, or at least his unique telling of a story that might have existed in oral tradition. This means we should be careful about treating it as central to Achlys' mythology. But it's still valuable because it shows how the figure of Achlys could be adapted and reinterpreted, how she could take on new roles while still remaining fundamentally herself. The witch-like aspect of Achlys in this story also connects to broader themes in late antique religion and literature. This was a period fascinated by magic, by the power of herbs and potions, by secret knowledge and hidden powers. Mystery cults were flourishing. People were looking for direct, personal access to divine power, often through marginal or transgressive means. In this context, a goddess who dwells in a dark cavern, who possesses secret knowledge of deadly substances, who can be approached by those desperate enough to seek her out, fits perfectly. She's not the respectable, public religion of temples and festivals. She's the dark, private religion of curses and poisons, of desperate measures and forbidden knowledge. And yet, even in this witch-like guise, Achlys retains her cosmic significance. She's not just some minor deity of poisons. She's the primordial misery, the eternal death mist, temporarily taking on this particular role for this particular story. The cavern she dwells in isn't just a cave. It's a threshold place, a point of contact between the light world of the living and the dark world of death and shadow. When Hera descends into that cavern to meet Achlys, she's making a kind of catabasis, a descent into the underworld. Not the full underworld of Hades, but a liminal space that partakes of that darkness. And Achlys, dwelling there, is the guardian of that threshold, the keeper of those deadly secrets. The poisonous flowers themselves become symbols of this threshold quality. They grow, presumably, in the world of light, in normal earth under normal sky. But they carry death within them, carrying Achlys' darkness inside their bright petals. They're creatures of both worlds, alive and dead, beautiful and deadly, natural and supernatural all at once. There's a kind of horrible poetry to it. The lampads, the torchbearers, the bringers of light, are killed by flowers that contain hidden darkness. Light is extinguished by beauty that conceals death. It's the perfect expression of Achlys' nature. She's the darkness that hides within things, the death that lurks behind life's facade, the misery that waits beneath every moment of joy. And the fact that she can create this, that she can manufacture death on demand, makes her even more terrifying than if she were just a passive force. She has agency. She has skill. She has knowledge. She knows how to make death, how to craft it, how to shape it to specific purposes. She's not just death personified. She died as an artist, a craftsperson, a creator. This raises unsettling questions. What other deadly things might Achlys have created? What other poisons, diseases, curses might have their origin in her dark cavern? When people in the ancient world died mysteriously, suddenly, painfully, did they wonder if Achlys had been involved? If somehow her deadly craft had reached out and touched them? The story in Nanas, for all its late date and questionable canonical status, adds a new dimension to our understanding of Achlys. She's not just ancient and cosmic. She's also immediate and practical. She's not just the mist that comes over dying eyes. She's the cause of death, the manufacturer of mortality, the artisan of agony. And she's willing to work with others. She takes commissions, you might say. If a goddess as powerful as Hera needs deadly flowers to commit divine murder, Achlys will provide them. No questions asked. No judgments made. Just death, delivered as requested. This makes her, in some ways, more disturbing than a deity who's purely evil or purely chaotic. Evil can be opposed. Chaos can be ordered. But Achlys, she's just doing her job. She's fulfilling her function. She's being what she is. And what she is death. What she is misery. What she is the darkness that can be weaponized, that can be directed, that can be used. The nymphs who died from her flowers didn't die because they were evil or because they deserved it. They died because Hera wanted them dead and Achlys provided the means. There's no justice in it, no cosmic balance, just the simple, awful fact that death is a tool that can be wielded, a weapon that can be crafted, a force that serves whoever knows how to call upon it. And deep in her shadowed cavern, Achlys waits. She waits for the next petitioner, the next request, the next opportunity to do what she does best. Create suffering, manufacture misery, bring the darkness that she herself embodies out into the light, disguised as something beautiful, as something harmless, as flowers that kill with a touch and a scent. Now we need to step back from the specific myths and stories and ask a broader question. What did Achlys mean to the ancient Greeks? What was she symbolizing? What aspect of human experience was being expressed through this figure of the death mist, this personification of misery and suffering? On the most basic level, Achlys represents something every human being fears, the moment of death. Not what comes after death, not the judgment or the afterlife, but the actual process of dying itself. That moment when consciousness begins to fade, when vision becomes unclear, when the world starts to slip away. It's a universal human experience, or at least a universal human anticipation. We all know it's coming. We all wonder what it will feel like. The Greeks, by personifying this as Achlys, were doing something psychologically sophisticated. They were taking an internal, subjective experience and giving it external form. The clouding of vision that comes with dying isn't just a physiological process. It's a goddess. It's a being. It's Achlys coming to claim your sight, to bring her characteristic mist. This externalization serves several purposes. First, it makes the experience more understandable. Instead of a mysterious biological shutdown, you have a clear explanation. A goddess is causing this. Second, it makes it more bearable, or at least more comprehensible. You're not just dying randomly. You're being claimed by a specific divine force. There's a pattern to it, a meaning, even if that meaning is dark. But Achlys represents more than just the physical process of dying. She's specifically the goddess of misery, of suffering, of pain and sorrow. This means she embodies the emotional and psychological aspects of suffering, as well as the physical. Think about what misery feels like. It's heavy, isn't it? It weighs you down. It clouds your thinking. It obscures your ability to see clearly, to think straight, to function normally. When you're truly miserable, when you're in the depths of suffering, the world becomes dim and distant. Colors are less bright. Sounds are less clear. It's as if a mist has descended over your experience of reality. That's Achlys. She's not just the death mist. She's the misery mist. She's the clouding that comes over your consciousness when suffering becomes overwhelming. She's depressed, in the old sense of being pressed down. She's the weight of sorrow, the burden of pain, the fog of grief. By making her a goddess, by giving her form and name, the Greeks were acknowledging that this misery is a real force in human life. It's not just something in your head. It's not just a psychological state. It's a goddess. It has presence, power, and reality. And that validation, that acknowledgement, might have been comforting in its own way. Your suffering isn't imaginary. Achlys is real. There's also something deeply existential about Achlys. She represents the fundamental fact that suffering is built into existence. If she existed before chaos, before creation, then suffering isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's fundamental. You can't escape it because it's woven into the very fabric of reality. This is a bleak philosophy, but it's also, in a strange way, liberating. If suffering is fundamental and unavoidable, then you can stop trying to eliminate it entirely. You can stop blaming yourself when you suffer. You can stop thinking that suffering means you've done something wrong or that the universe is punishing you. No, suffering is just Achlys doing what Achlys does. It's not personal. It's not punishment. It's just reality. The Greeks didn't shy away from this bleakness. They didn't try to sugarcoat existence or pretend that life was fundamentally good or fair. They looked at the world honestly and saw that suffering was everywhere, that misery was constant, that death came for everyone. And instead of denying this or pretending otherwise, they created a goddess to embody it. They named it. They gave it a form. They acknowledged its power. Achlys also represents the limits of human power and knowledge. No matter how strong you are, how clever, how favored by the gods, you can't escape the death mist. It comes for heroes and cowards alike, for kings and slaves, for the pious and the impious. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, felt the Achlys descend over his eyes just like any common soldier. No one is exempt. This democratization of death and suffering might have been oddly comforting. Yes, you're going to suffer. Yes, you're going to die. Yes, the mist will come for your eyes. But so is everyone else. You're not special in your suffering. You're not alone in it. Every human who has ever lived or ever will live shares this with you. There's also something about Achlys that speaks to the hiddenness of suffering. She's a mist, a fog, something that obscures and conceals. Other people can't see your internal suffering. They can't see the mist that's descending over your consciousness. You might be smiling on the outside while inside, Achlys is claiming you bit by bit. This hidden quality of suffering, this privacy of pain, is something the Greeks understood deeply. The ancient world didn't have our therapeutic culture, our emphasis on sharing feelings and processing emotions. Suffering was often born silently, privately. Achlys represents that hidden misery, the suffering that happens out of sight, in the dark cavern of individual consciousness. The fact that Achlys received no temples, no worship, no prayers is also significant. You can't appease her. You can't bargain with her. You can't make offerings to make her go away. She's not that kind of deity. She's inevitable, unchangeable, unavoidable. All you can do is acknowledge her existence and steel yourself for her eventual arrival. This is very different from most Greek gods, who could be influenced, persuaded, bribed with the right sacrifices. Even death itself, in the form of Thanatos, could sometimes be tricked or delayed. But Achlys, she's beyond all that. She represents the irreducible minimum of suffering that simply exists, that can't be mitigated or managed or prayed away. In terms of gender symbolism, Achlys being female is worth considering. Death and misery being personified as feminine might reflect ancient associations between women and the mysteries of transformation, between the feminine and threshold states. Women give birth, bringing souls into the world. Perhaps it makes sense, in that symbolic logic, for a feminine figure to also mark the departure of souls from the world. But Achlys isn't a nurturing feminine figure. She's not a mother in any positive sense. If anything, she's the anti-mother, taking life away instead of giving it, bringing darkness instead of light, causing suffering instead of relief. She's the shadow side of the feminine, the aspect that destroys rather than creates. This isn't unique to Achlys. Many death deities in Greek mythology are female. The Charis, the Moirai, Nyx herself. There seems to be something in the Greek imagination that associates the feminine with these threshold moments, these transitions between states. But it's a dark, terrifying femininity, not a comfortable or comforting one. Achlys also symbolizes the moment of transition. She's not death itself, not the state of being dead. She's the process of dying, the threshold between life and death. This liminal quality makes her particularly unsettling. She exists in the in-between, in the neither here nor there, in that awful moment when you're not quite alive, but not quite dead either. Liminal states have always frightened humans. We like categories. We like clear boundaries. The idea that there's a state that's neither one thing nor another, that there's a moment when you're suspended between existence and non-existence, is deeply disturbing. And Achlys rules that moment. She owns it. She is it. In philosophical terms, Achlys might represent what we now call existential dread. Not the fear of any specific thing, but the fundamental anxiety that comes from being conscious in a universe where suffering and death are unavoidable. She's the personification of that knowledge, that terrible awareness that no matter what you do, misery will find you, darkness will claim you, the mist will descend. And yet, by personifying this, by making it a goddess, the Greeks were also containing it. Achlys is terrifying, yes, but she's also knowledgeable. She has characteristics. She has a form, however horrible. She's not just formless dread. She's a specific dread with a specific face, however much blood drips from its cheeks. There's a kind of courage in this. The Greeks looked at the worst aspects of existence, at suffering and death and misery, and they didn't flinch. They didn't pretend these things didn't exist or weren't important. They gave them divine status. They said, yes, this is real. This is powerful. This is worthy of recognition. Achlys forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Suffering exists. Death is coming. No one is exempt. The mist will descend over all our eyes eventually. These aren't pleasant thoughts, but they're true thoughts. And perhaps there's value in facing them honestly, in acknowledging them fully, rather than hiding from them or pretending they're less significant than they are. In the end, Achlys symbolizes the shadow side of existence, the dark half of reality that we'd rather not think about but can't escape. She's the price of consciousness, the cost of being alive. She's what the universe demands of every living thing, that eventually, finally, you'll suffer and you'll die and the mist will come. But by naming her, by giving her form, by making her a goddess, the Greeks were also asserting a kind of mastery over her. They couldn't escape her, but they could understand her. They couldn't defeat her, but they could face her. They couldn't make her go away, but they could look at her in her terrible, blood-streaked face and say, "We know you. We see you. And we're not going to pretend you don't exist." That takes a kind of strength. That takes a kind of honesty. And in that honesty, in that unflinching acknowledgement of reality's darkest aspects, there's something almost noble. Achlys is terrifying, but our ancestors weren't afraid to acknowledge her terror. She's miserable, but they weren't afraid to name that misery. And maybe that's what Achlys ultimately symbolizes, not just suffering and death, but our capacity to face suffering and death without illusion, without false comfort, with eyes open, even as the mist begins to descend. We've already discussed Hesiod's terrifying description of Achlys on the shield of Heracles, but now we need to examine the broader context of that description. Why is she on the shield? What's the significance of her placement? And what does her presence tell us about Greek attitudes toward war, death, and the psychology of combat? The Shield of Heracles is a poem that focuses intensely on the shield itself. Of the poem's 480 lines, more than 200 are dedicated to describing what's depicted on this extraordinary piece of defensive armor. This isn't unusual in Greek epic. Homer's Iliad contains a famous extended description of the shield of Achilles, crafted by Hephaestus, that shows scenes of city life, war, peace, agriculture, and celebration. But Heracles' shield is different. Where Achilles' shield shows the fullness of human life, both dark and light, Heracles' shield is overwhelmingly focused on death, terror, and horror. It's not a celebration of human achievement. It's a weapon of psychological warfare. The shield is described as being made of multiple layers of materials, with intricate enamel work depicting various scenes. And among these scenes, given prominent placement, is Achlys, standing alongside other terrifying figures, the Fates, the Keres, battles, slaughter, and various personifications of doom and destruction. The strategic placement of Achlys on the shield tells us something crucial. She's not hidden away in a corner. She's not a minor decorative element. She's featured, prominent, meant to be seen clearly by anyone facing Heracles in combat. The description we examined earlier, with all its horrifying detail, is what an enemy warrior would see when he looked at the shield. And that's entirely the point. Imagine you're a warrior in ancient Greece. You've been trained to fight, certainly, but you're still human. You still feel fear. You still dread death. And then you face Heracles, and you look at his shield, and you see Achlys. You see her pallid, parched skin. You see the mucus dripping from her nostrils. You see the blood flowing from her cheeks. You see her terrible grin and her long claws. What you're seeing is your own death. You're seeing what awaits you if this fight goes badly. You're seeing the mist that will descend over your eyes, personified as this hideous, starving, bleeding goddess. And that image is designed to terrify you, to make you hesitate, to plant doubt in your mind about whether you really want to continue this fight. This is psychological warfare at its finest. The shield isn't just protecting Heracles physically. It's attacking his enemies mentally. It's saying, look at what death looks like. Look at how horrible it is. Do you really want to experience this today? But there's something deeper going on here too. By placing Achlys on his shield, Heracles is making a statement about his own relationship with death. He's not denying it. He's not pretending that death isn't real or isn't terrible. He's carrying it with him, literally bearing the image of death into battle. He's staring into the face of death and fighting anyway. This is actually incredibly psychologically sophisticated. Modern military psychology has recognized that soldiers who acknowledge and accept the reality of death often perform better in combat than those who deny or suppress that reality. By facing death squarely, by looking at its horrible face without flinching, you paradoxically become less paralyzed by fear of it. Heracles, by carrying Achlys on his shield, is demonstrating this acceptance. He knows death is real. He knows it's horrible. He sees it, right there on his shield, every time he looks at it. And yet he fights on. This makes him not less human, but more courageous, because true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's facing what you fear and acting anyway. The other figures depicted alongside Achlys on the shield reinforce this theme. The Moirai, or Fates, are there, representing the inescapability of destiny. The Charis are there, personifying violent death in battle. There are scenes of warriors fighting and dying, of cities being sacked, of all the horror that war entails. The shield doesn't shy away from any of it. It puts it all on display. This comprehensive vision of war's reality serves multiple purposes. For enemies, it's intimidating. For Heracles himself, it's a constant reminder of what he's engaged in, what stakes he's playing for. There's no room for romantic illusions when you're carrying a shield that shows you exactly what death looks like. The placement of these figures also creates a kind of symbolic cosmology. The fates determine when you'll die. The Charis execute that sentence. And Achlys marks the moment of transition, bringing her characteristic mist. Together, they represent the complete process of death, from decree to execution to experiential reality. They're all there on the shield, all visible, all acknowledged. What's particularly striking is that Heracles is fighting sickness, a son of Ares, the god of war himself. This is a battle between two warriors of extraordinary prowess, both with divine parentage, both destined for legendary status. And yet, even in this elevated context, even in this clash of heroes, Achlys is present. Death doesn't care about your lineage. Misery doesn't respect your divine blood. The mist comes for heroes and common soldiers alike. The shield is described as being so heavy that most men couldn't even lift it, and so brilliantly crafted that it shines with supernatural light. This is clearly not realistic armor. It's mythic armor, functioning as much in symbolic space as in physical space. And what it's symbolizing, through figures like Achlys, is the reality of mortality that underlies all human endeavor, even the most heroic. There's also something interesting about the fact that these images are fixed, permanent. They're enameled onto the shield. They don't change. Achlys is always there, always grinning her terrible grin, always dripping blood from her cheeks. This permanence reflects the unchanging nature of death and suffering. They're constants. They're reliable. They're always present, whether acknowledged or not. By putting them on his shield, Heracles is choosing to acknowledge them, to make them visible, to keep them always in sight. He's not hiding from reality. He's carrying it with him, using it as both a weapon and reminder. The craftsmanship of Hephaestus also matters here. Hephaestus is the divine smith, the god of craft and artifice. He works with fire and metal, transforming raw materials into objects of beauty and power. But what he's depicting on this shield isn't beautiful. It's horrible, yet it's still a masterwork. The horror is rendered with exquisite skill. This suggests something about art and truth. Sometimes, creating a true representation means creating something ugly, something disturbing, something that makes viewers uncomfortable. Hephaestus doesn't prettify Achlys. He doesn't make her more palatable. He renders her exactly as she is, hideous, suffering, terrible. And that truthful rendering is its own kind of beauty, the beauty of honest craftsmanship, of not lying about reality. The shield also functions as a kind of memento mori, that artistic tradition of reminders of death. Medieval artists would include skulls in their paintings. Victorian photographers would take pictures of the dead. The shield of Heracles does something similar. It keeps death present, visible, acknowledged. You can't forget about mortality when you're carrying its image into battle. And this might have made Heracles a more effective warrior. Warriors who accept death, who have made peace with their own mortality, often fight more fiercely and more effectively than those who are still terrified of dying. There's a kind of freedom that comes from acceptance. If you've already faced death, if you carry its image with you, if you've looked into Achlys's bleeding face and terrible grin, then what can an enemy do to you that's worse than what you've already contemplated? The shield creates a kind of mirror effect too. When an enemy looks at it, he sees his death. When Heracles looks at it, he sees his own mortality. Both are confronted with the same truth, the same reality. But Heracles has the advantage of having lived with this knowledge, carried it with him, made it part of his equipment. He's had time to process it, to accept it, to integrate it into his understanding of himself and his purpose. The poem itself tells us that when Cycnus and his father Ares see Heracles with this shield, they pause. They're affected by it. The shield is doing its psychological work before a single blow is struck. And when the battle does commence, Heracles emerges victorious. The shield, with Achlys and all the other death figures emblazoned on it, has served its purpose. But it's not just about intimidating the enemy. It's also about truth. The shield tells the truth about war. War isn't glorious. It's not noble. It's death and suffering and the mist descending over dying eyes. And by carrying that truth into battle, Heracles is fighting with honesty, with clear sight, with no illusions to cloud his judgment. This makes Achlys' presence on the shield particularly appropriate. She is the clouding of sight, but by depicting her clearly, by making her visible and acknowledged, the shield paradoxically creates clarity. It removes illusions. It shows what war really is. And maybe that's the ultimate significance of Achlys' placement on the shield of Heracles. She represents the truth that can't be hidden, the reality that can't be denied. You can try to ignore death and suffering. You can try to pretend they're not fundamental aspects of existence. But they are, and eventually, they'll catch up with you. Better to acknowledge them now, to face them squarely, to carry them with you as Heracles carries his shield, than to be surprised and overwhelmed by them when they inevitably arrive. The shield says, "This is real. This is true. This is what awaits all of us. And I'm fighting anyway. Not because I don't know what death looks like. I see it every day, right here on my shield. But because I know and I choose to act regardless." That's heroism in the Greek sense. Not fearlessness, but action despite fear. Not ignorance of death, but acknowledgement of death and choice to live fully anyway. And Achlys, horrible as she is part of what makes that heroism possible. By showing us the worst, by refusing to prettify or deny reality, she gives us the opportunity to face that reality with courage. The shield of Heracles, with Achlys prominently displayed on it, isn't just defensive equipment. It's a philosophical statement, a psychological tool, and a work of art that tells uncomfortable truths. And sometimes, those uncomfortable truths are exactly what we need to see. To really understand Achlys, we need to understand the broader context of ancient Greek attitudes toward death, suffering, and the dying process. How did the Greeks think about death? What role did it play in their philosophy, their religion, their daily life? And how did a figure like Achlys fit into that larger cultural framework? The ancient Greeks had a complex, multifaceted relationship with death. It wasn't a single, simple concept for them. Death had many aspects, many personifications, many meanings. There was Thanatos, the personification of death itself, usually depicted as a gentle figure who brought peaceful death. There was Hades, the god of the underworld, ruler of the realm of the dead. There was Moirai, who determined the length of each person's life. There were the Keres, who brought violent death on the battlefield. And then there was Achlys, who represented something slightly different from all of these. She wasn't death itself, wasn't the afterlife, wasn't fate, wasn't the moment of killing. She was the experience of dying, the subjective, internal process of transitioning from life to death. She was what it felt like, particularly the visual aspect, the mist, the clouding, the darkness descending. This distinction is important because it shows how sophisticated Greek thinking about death was. They didn't treat it as a single, monolithic thing. They recognized that death has many components. The decree of fate, the moment of killing, the experience of dying, the state of being dead, the journey to the underworld, the judgment of souls, the existence in Hades. Each of these aspects was personified separately, given its own divine representation. Achlys' role, specifically representing the subjective experience of dying, tells us that the Greeks were paying attention to what death felt like, not just what it meant or what caused it. They were interested in phenomenology, in the first-person perspective of someone going through this ultimate transition. And what they observed was the Achlys, the mist or darkness that descended over the eyes. This was a real, observable phenomenon. Anyone who had watched someone die would have seen it. The glazing of the eyes, the loss of focus, the clouding that comes as vision fades. In modern medical terms, this is caused by various factors. The pupils may become fixed, the cornea may begin to cloud as tear production stops, the brain's visual processing begins to shut down. But the Greeks interpreted this as a divine presence. Achlys was actually there, actually bringing her mist, actually claiming each dying person's vision. This interpretation gave meaning and pattern to what might otherwise have seemed like a random biological process. It wasn't random. It was Achlys doing her work. This need to personify, to give divine names and faces to natural processes, was central to Greek religious thought. The Greeks lived in a world that felt personal, animated by divine presences and intentions. The thunder wasn't just noise, it was Zeus speaking. The sea's violence wasn't just weather, it was Poseidon's anger. And the clouding of dying eyes wasn't just biology, it was Achlys arriving to mark the transition. But notice what Achlys didn't receive: worship. There were no temples to Achlys, no prayers asking for her favor, no festivals in her honor, no priests or priestesses dedicated to her service. This is unusual for a Greek deity and tells us something important about her nature and role. Some deities weren't worshipped because they represented forces that couldn't be influenced or negotiated with. You can pray to Zeus for rain. You can make offerings to Athena for wisdom in battle. You can ask Aphrodite for help and love. But what would you pray to Achlys for? Please don't bring your mist when I die. That's not how it works. The mist is inevitable. Achlys is inevitable. She's not a deity who can be persuaded or bribed. She simply is, and she does what she does, and no amount of prayer or sacrifice will change that. This inevitability places Achlys in a special category of Greek religious thought. She's more like a natural law than a person. She's automatic, mechanical even, in her functioning. When someone dies, Achlys brings the mist. Every time, without exception. It's as reliable as gravity. The lack of temples and worship also suggests that Achlys was understood as something you didn't want to interact with. Some deities were approached regularly, incorporated into daily religious practice. Others, like Achlys, were acknowledged but kept at a distance. You knew she existed. You knew she'd come for you eventually. But you didn't invite her presence. You didn't celebrate her. You certainly didn't ask for her attention. This avoidance wasn't unusual for death-related deities. Hades himself received relatively little worship compared to the Olympian gods. People were reluctant to speak his name directly, preferring euphemisms like the wealthy one or the hospitable one. Death gods made people uncomfortable, and understandably so. Nobody wanted to attract their attention. But Achlys might have been even more disturbing than Hades because she represented not the abstract fact of death, but the concrete, physical, horrible reality of dying. Hades ruled over the dead, which was abstract, distant, not immediately visceral. Achlys was right there in the moment when life ended, marking that transition with her presence. She was too close, too immediate, too real to be comfortable. Greek philosophy, particularly in the classical period, spent considerable time thinking about death. Socrates famously said that philosophy was the practice of death, meaning that philosophers spent their time learning how to die well, how to face death with courage and wisdom. Plato wrote extensively about the soul's immortality and what might happen after death. The Stoics developed elaborate arguments for why death shouldn't be feared. But you notice that even philosophical discussions of death tend to focus on either the fact of death, is it bad? Should we fear it? Or the afterlife? Does the soul survive? What happens next? They don't spend much time on the actual process of dying, the subjective experience of that transition. Perhaps that was too visceral, too immediate, too painful to examine philosophically. And that's where Achlys lives, in that unexamined space, in the actual moment of dying that philosophy prefers not to dwell on. She represents what remains after all the philosophical arguments have been made and all the comfort has been offered. At the end, when the actual dying happens, Achlys is there. And no philosophy, no argument, no wisdom can change that. The Greeks were also deeply concerned with the idea of a good death. A good death meant dying well, dying bravely, dying in a way that brought honor rather than shame. For a warrior, a good death meant dying in battle, facing the enemy, fighting to the last. For a citizen, it might mean dying in service to your city. For anyone, it meant facing death with courage and dignity. But Achlys doesn't care about good deaths or bad deaths. She comes to all of them. The hero dying gloriously on the battlefield gets the mist. The coward dying while fleeing gets the mist. The sick person dying in bed gets the mist. The old person peacefully passing gets the mist. Achlys is the great equalizer, treating all deaths the same, marking them all with her characteristic clouding. This democratic quality of Achlys might have been oddly comforting. Yes, death comes to everyone, but it comes in the same way to everyone. There's no special, worse death reserved for the bad or the unlucky. There's no special, better death granted to the good or the fortunate. There's just death, and there's Achlys, and she treats everyone the same. The Greeks were also very aware of death as a daily reality in ways that modern people in developed countries often aren't. Infant mortality was high. Disease was common and often fatal. War was frequent. Life expectancy was low. Death was visible, present, undeniable. You couldn't avoid confronting it. In this context, personifications like Achlys served a psychological function. They made death something you could name, something you could talk about, something you could incorporate into your stories and your understanding of the world. Instead of a nameless, formless terror, death became a collection of deities and spirits, each with their own characteristics and roles. You could say, Achlys will come for me, and that was somehow better than saying, I will die and I don't know what that means or what it will be like. The Greek tragic poets, especially, were deeply engaged with themes of death and suffering. In their plays, characters die constantly, often violently and horribly. And the language they use to describe these deaths often references the Achlys, the mist or darkness that comes over dying eyes. It's a standard poetic formula, appearing again and again in tragic verse. This repetition serves to reinforce the reality and inevitability of death. The audience, watching tragedy after tragedy, sees the mist descend over character after character. They're being reminded, repeatedly, that this is how death works. This is what it looks like. This is what awaits everyone. And yet, Greek culture wasn't paralyzed by this awareness of death. If anything, it seemed to energize them. The awareness that life was short and death certainly led to an intense engagement with life, a desire to achieve something memorable, to leave a mark, to win Cleos, glory, or fame that would outlast death. If Achlys was coming for everyone, then what mattered was what you did before she arrived. This created an interesting tension in Greek culture. On one hand, death was terrible, inevitable, to be feared and delayed as long as possible. On the other hand, the certainty of death gave life urgency and meaning. You couldn't waste time. You had to act, to achieve, to become worthy of being remembered. Achlys would claim your vision eventually, but what had you done while you could still see? The concept of the death mist also had medical implications. Ancient Greek medicine, as practiced by figures like Hippocrates, was deeply observant of symptoms and signs. The clouding of the eyes was recognized as a sign of impending death, a marker that physicians would look for when determining a patient's prognosis. In this context, Achlys was almost a diagnostic tool, a way of recognizing when death was imminent. But even in medical contexts, there was an awareness that this wasn't just a symptom. It was also a divine presence. Medicine and religion weren't separate in the ancient world the way they often are now. The clouding of the eyes was both a biological process that doctors recognized and a divine action that everyone understood as Achlys' work. Both explanations could be true simultaneously without contradiction. The Greeks also had various euphemisms and indirect ways of talking about death, but interestingly, Achlys wasn't usually one of them. When they wanted to speak of death indirectly, they might talk about going to Hades, or the long sleep, or crossing the river. But when they talked about Achlys, they were being direct, specific, descriptive. They were talking about the actual visible phenomenon of dying eyes. This directness suggests that while death in general might be avoided in conversation, the specific reality of the death mist was something that couldn't and shouldn't be euphemized. There's also an interesting intersection between Achlys and Greek concepts of vision and knowledge. The Greeks valued sight highly. To see was to know. The Greek word for I know, oida, is related to the word for I have seen. Knowledge was fundamentally visual for them. So when Achlys takes away your vision, she's not just ending your life. She's ending your knowledge, your understanding, your connection to the world of seeing and knowing. This makes her assault particularly profound. She doesn't just kill you. She blinds you first. She cuts you off from knowledge and understanding before she cuts you off from life. The mist doesn't come after death. It comes during dying, which means you experience the loss of vision, the loss of knowledge, the loss of connection to the visible world. You're aware of losing awareness. That's perhaps the cruelest aspect of Achlys' nature. In religious terms, Achlys existed in a kind of theological gray area. She wasn't quite a major deity like the Olympians. She wasn't quite a minor deity like the various nymphs and spirits. She was something else, something more fundamental and more abstract. She was closer to being a personified force than a person who happened to be divine. This ambiguous status might explain why she appears so rarely in Greek literature outside of specific contexts like Homer's battle scenes and Hesiod's shield description. She wasn't a character who could be developed, who could have relationships and conflicts and stories. She was too automatic, too mechanical, too much a force of nature to be a compelling protagonist or antagonist in narrative. But that doesn't mean she wasn't important. If anything, her very inevitability made her more significant than many more famous deities. Zeus might be king of the gods, but he couldn't stop Achlys from doing her work. Athena might be wise and powerful, but when her mortal favorites died, Achlys claimed their vision just like anyone else's. No deity, no matter how powerful, could prevent the death mist from descending when the time came. This supreme inevitability placed Achlys, in a sense, above the divine hierarchy. She didn't answer Zeus. She didn't need permission from Hades. She simply functioned, automatically and eternally, marking every death with her characteristic mist. In this way, she represented something even the gods had to respect: the absolute, unchanging laws that governed existence itself. The ancient Greeks, in creating and maintaining the concept of Achlys, were demonstrating a remarkable psychological and philosophical sophistication. They were recognizing that death has multiple dimensions, that the experience of dying is distinct from the fact of death, that the subjective, phenomenological aspect of mortality deserves its own acknowledgement and representation. They were also demonstrating a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Achlys is not a comforting figure. She offers no solace, no hope, no promise of something better. She's just the mist, the darkness, the clouding. And yet the Greeks didn't flinch from her. They described her in horrifying detail. They put her on shields and mentioned her in poetry. They acknowledged her reality and her power. This honesty, this refusal to look away from death's harsh realities, might be one of the most valuable things we can learn from Greek approaches to mortality. They didn't have the modern luxury of medical technology that can delay death and sanitize dying. They didn't have the modern tendency to hide death away in hospitals and nursing homes to keep it out of sight and out of mind. They lived with death as a constant presence, and they created figures like Achlys to help them make sense of that presence. And in doing so, they created something that still resonates today. Because while our circumstances have changed, while we've developed new ways of thinking about death and dying, the fundamental experience remains the same. Vision still fades as death approaches. Consciousness still clouds. The world still grows dim and distant. Achlys, in that sense, is still there, still doing her work, still bringing her mist to every dying person. We might not think of it as a goddess anymore. We might understand it in biological and neurological terms. But the experience is the same. And the ancient Greeks, by giving it a name, by acknowledging it as real and significant, by making it part of their mythology and their culture, were honoring something true and important about the human condition. That's the ultimate significance of Achlys in ancient Greek thought. She represents the willingness to face death honestly, to acknowledge suffering fully, to look at the darkest aspects of existence without flinching. And in that honesty, that courage, that unflinching gaze, there's something worth admiring and perhaps worth emulating. We need to explore how Achlys relates to the broader Greek concept of fate and destiny, particularly her connection to the Moirai, those three sister goddesses who spun, measured, and cut the thread of every human life. Because while Achlys and the Moirai have different functions, they're part of the same inevitable machinery of mortality, the same inescapable system that governs how and when every person dies. The Moirai, known to the Romans as the Fates, were three sisters: Clotho, who spun the thread of life; Lachesis, who measured its length; and Atropos, whose name literally means unavoidable, who cut the thread, ending each life. They were ancient, powerful, and respected even by Zeus himself. In some accounts, they were daughters of Nyx, which would make them sisters to Achlys if we accept that genealogy. In other accounts, they were daughters of Zeus and Themis, making them more integrated into the Olympian system. But regardless of their parentage, the Moirai represented something fundamental. The idea that each person's lifespan is predetermined, that there's a fixed amount of time allotted to each individual, and when that time is up, death comes. This is the Greek concept of Moira, which means both fate and allotted portion. Your Moira is your share of life, and when you've used it up, that's it. Now, here's where Achlys fits into this system. The Moirai determine when you die. They decide the length of your thread, the span of your days. But they're abstract, distant, working at the level of cosmic law rather than individual experience. Atropos cuts your thread, and that decree goes forth. Your time is up. But someone has to execute that decree at the physical level. Someone has to actually bring death about. That might be the Charis on the battlefield, or Thanatos in more peaceful circumstances, or simply disease, or old age, or accident. Various forces can be the immediate cause of death. And then, in that moment when death is actually happening, when the thread has been cut and the execution is underway, Achlys arrives with her mist. She marks the moment. She's the experiential reality of what the Moirai decreed, the subjective side of the objective fact of fate. This creates a kind of assembly line of death, if you want to think of it mechanically. Moirai set the timing. The Charis or other deathbringers provide the means. And Achlys marks the moment, bringing the characteristic death mist that signals the transition is happening. But it's more than just mechanical. There's a philosophical depth to this relationship between fate and the death mist. The Moirai represent the idea that death is inevitable and predetermined. You can't escape your fate. When Atropos is ready to cut your thread, no power on earth or in heaven can stop her. Even Zeus, according to some accounts, can't override Moirai's decisions. Achlys, then, is the manifestation of that inevitability at the individual, experiential level. Moirai's decree is abstract. Achlys makes it concrete. The Moirai say this person will die now. Achlys brings the mist that makes that decree real in the dying person's experience. This connection between fate and the death mist speaks to something profound about Greek attitudes toward destiny. The Greeks believed strongly in fate, in the idea that certain things were predetermined and couldn't be changed. But they also believed in individual experience, in the reality and importance of subjective consciousness. Achlys bridges these two beliefs. She's both the instrument of fate and the experience of dying. She's both objective reality and subjective phenomenon. There's also an interesting temporal dimension to consider. The Moirai work outside of time, in a sense. They see the entire thread of your life at once, from birth to death. They know when you'll die before you're even born. But Achlys works on time. She appears at the specific moment of death. She's temporal, immediate, present. She's the way that eternal fate manifests in temporal experience. In Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, where we get that horrifying description of Achlys, she's explicitly placed alongside Moirai. They're depicted together on the shield, working in concert. The Moirai are shown fighting over dying men, presumably determining who dies when, while Achlys stands nearby with her terrible grin, ready to bring her mist to each one whose thread is cut. This visual association on the shield reinforces their functional connection. They're partners in death, each playing their role in the inevitable process of mortality. The Moirai decree. Achlys executes. Together, they ensure that no one escapes death when their time has come. But there's also a kind of horror in this partnership. The Moirai are at least somewhat impersonal. They're following cosmic law, maintaining the order of things. There's nothing personal in their decrees. Your thread is a certain length, and that's just how it is. But Achlys, she's viscerally, physically present. She brings the mist. She stands there grinning as your vision fades. She makes fate personal and immediate and terrifying. The Greek concept of fate itself is complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, fate is absolute and unchangeable. What the Moirai decree will happen. On the other hand, Greek literature is full of stories of people trying to escape fate, trying to change what's been decreed. And sometimes, within certain limits, they succeed in delaying or slightly altering their fates. But here's what never changes. When death comes, Achlys comes with it. You might postpone your fated death for a time. You might avoid one dangerous situation only to die in another. But when you finally die, however it happens, whenever it happens, Achlys will be there. The mist will descend. That's the one absolutely unchangeable part of the process. This makes Achlys, in a way, more inevitable than fate itself. Fate can be complicated. The Moirai's decrees can be subject to interpretation or minor modification. But the death mist? It's simple. It's absolute. It's unchanging. When you die, your vision clouds. Every time. No exceptions. Achlys guarantees that much. There's also a question of awareness. Do the Moirai know you personally? Do they care about you as an individual? Probably not. They're dealing with countless threads, countless lives. You're just one thread among billions, stretching back to the beginning of humanity and forward to its end. But Achlys, she's there for your death specifically. She brings the mist to your eyes particularly. In her terrible way, she's paying attention to you as an individual in your final moments. This creates an odd intimacy. The Moirai are distant, cosmic, abstract. Achlys is close, immediate, personal. When the Moirai cut your thread, you don't feel it. You don't experience that cosmic act. But when Achlys brings her mist, you absolutely experience it. You feel your vision fading. You're aware of the darkness descending. It's happening to you, and you know it's happening. In Greek philosophy, particularly among the Stoics, there was much discussion about how to face fate with equanimity, how to accept what's been decreed without fear or resistance. Marcus Aurelius wrote about accepting death calmly as a natural and necessary part of existence. Epictetus taught that we should focus only on what's in our control and accept what isn't. But even the most stoic acceptance of fate doesn't change the fact that when death comes, Achlys brings her mist. You can accept death philosophically. You can understand it intellectually. You can make peace with your mortality. But when the moment comes, your vision will still cloud. The mist will still descend. Achlys will still do her work. Philosophy can prepare your mind, but it can't change what your dying body experiences. This might seem bleak, but there's also something clarifying about it. It strips away pretense and illusion. You can tell yourself whatever stories you want about death and fate and destiny, but at the end, the experience is what it is. The mist comes. The eyes cloud. That's the irreducible reality that no amount of philosophy or theology or wishful thinking can change. The connection between Achlys and fate also raises interesting questions about free will. If the Moirai have predetermined when you'll die, do you have any choice in the matter? Can your actions change anything? Greek thought was divided on this question. Some believed in absolute fate, others in a kind of limited free will within fate's boundaries. But regardless of how much free will you have in life, in death you have none. Achlys doesn't give you options. She doesn't negotiate. When your time comes, however it comes, she brings the mist. You can't choose to not have your vision cloud as you die. You can't opt out of the death mist. It's as automatic and inevitable as gravity. This absoluteness connects back to the idea that Achlys might have existed before even chaos. If she's that fundamental, that primordial, then she predates choice itself. She predates free will. She's part of the bedrock of existence, the foundation that was there before questions of agency and choice even arose. She simply is, and she does what she does, and nothing can change that. In Greek tragedy, characters often struggle against fate, trying to avoid the dooms that have been prophesied for them. Oedipus tries to escape the prophecy that he'll kill his father and marry his mother. The result of his attempts to avoid fate is that he fulfills it precisely. This is the classic tragic irony. Your attempts to escape fate are the very means by which fate is fulfilled. But notice that even in these stories of fate and attempts to escape it, when characters finally die, the descriptions often include references to the Achlys, the mist descending over eyes. The tragic hero might struggle mightily against his fate, might try every possible means to avoid his doom, but in the end, when death comes, it comes in the same way it comes to everyone. The mist descends. Achlys arrives. Fate and the death mist converge in that final moment. This convergence might be the ultimate point of the connection between Achlys and the Moirai. They represent different aspects of the same inescapable truth. Mortality is inevitable, death will come, and when it does, it will happen in a specific, unchangeable way. The Moirai spin and measure and cut. Achlys brings the mist. Together, they ensure that no one escapes, no one gets special treatment, no one avoids the common fate of all living things. And perhaps that's oddly comforting in its way. Yes, death is inevitable. Yes, the Moirai have decreed your end. Yes, Achlys will come for your eyes. But this is true for everyone. You're not alone in this. Every human who has ever lived has faced the same fate, has felt the same mist descending. The Moirai's threads run through all of us, and Achlys' mist clouds all our eyes. In death, at least, we're all equal, all subject to the same inevitable laws, all experiencing the same final darkness. The connection between fate and the death mist teaches us something important about the Greek worldview. They didn't believe in arbitrary death. They believed death was ordered, fated, part of a larger cosmic system. But they also didn't believe that order made death less real or less physical or less experiential. Your fated death would still hurt. It would still be frightening. The mist would still descend. Fate might determine when and how, but it didn't determine what it would feel like. That was Achlys' domain, and she treated everyone the same. In the end, the Moirai and Achlys together represent the complete package of mortality. The decree and the execution, the abstract and the concrete, the eternal and the temporal, the cosmic law and the individual experience. You can't have one without the other. The thread must be cut, and the eyes must cloud. Fate must be fulfilled, and the mist must descend. And in that terrible, perfect system, where every death is both predetermined and experientially real, both fated and felt, Achlys stands waiting. She's been there since before the beginning, and she'll be there past the end. Eternal, inevitable, unchanging. The mist that comes for all, the darkness that claims all sight, the final reality that even fate cannot change or soften. That's the connection between Achlys and destiny. She is destiny's final face, fate's last word, the unavoidable end that makes every Moirai's decree real in dying flesh and fading consciousness. Now let's leap forward in time from ancient Greece to the modern world. What happened to Achlys? How has this primordial goddess of the death mist been interpreted, reimagined, or incorporated into contemporary culture? The answer might surprise you, because while Achlys isn't as famous as Zeus or Athena, she has found her way into modern mythology in some fascinating ways. The revival of interest in Greek mythology in the modern era, particularly in popular culture, has led to countless retellings and reimaginings of classical stories. Fantasy literature, young adult fiction, comic books, video games, and movies have all drawn heavily on Greek mythological themes and characters. And while the major Olympians get most of the attention, occasionally more obscure figures like Achlys get their moment in the spotlight. One of the most significant modern appearances of Achlys is in Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, specifically in The Mark of Athena, part of the Heroes of Olympus sequence. Riordan, who has done more than perhaps any other modern author to popularize Greek mythology for young readers, chose to include Achlys as a character, and his interpretation is both faithful to the ancient sources and creatively adapted for a contemporary audience. In Riordan's version, Achlys is encountered in Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, by two of the series' heroes, Percy Jackson and Annabeth Chase. She's depicted much as Hesiod described her: miserable, grotesque, covered in tears and mucus, hunched and starving. But Riordan adds elements that make her relevant to his young adult audience. She's not just the death mist. She's also associated with deadly poison, which recalls the Nonus account we discussed earlier. What's particularly clever about Riordan's use of Achlys is how he captures the existential horror of the character while making it accessible to teenage readers. Achlys in his books is pitiable and terrifying simultaneously. She's suffered for so long, been miserable for so many eons, that she's become almost mad with it. She wants others to experience her misery, to share in her eternal suffering. In the climactic confrontation, Percy actually defeats Achlys by using her own nature against her. He manipulates poison, turning Achlys' own tears and the toxins she creates back on her. It's a vivid, disturbing scene that pushes the boundaries of what's typically depicted in young adult fiction. Percy essentially tortures Achlys with her own misery, and in doing so, he horrifies even himself and his companion. This interpretation does something interesting. It makes Achlys not just an external force, but also a representation of internal darkness, of the capacity for cruelty that exists even in heroes. Percy defeats Achlys, but in doing so, he becomes briefly like her, wielding misery as a weapon. It's a psychologically complex moment that uses the mythological figure to explore deeper themes about the nature of heroism and the dangers of becoming what you fight against. Riordan's Achlys has introduced the goddess to a whole new generation, many of whom might never have encountered her otherwise. And while his version takes liberties with the source material, it captures something essential about the character. She's ancient, miserable, terrifying, and pitiable all at once. Beyond Riordan's books, Achlys has appeared in various video games, particularly those that draw on mythological themes. In these interactive contexts, she's often portrayed as a boss character or a source of dark power, embodying difficulty, challenge, and the ever-present threat of death that's central to gaming mechanics. The player must overcome her or, in some cases, harness her power. This gaming interpretation taps into something interesting about Achlys' nature. In a video game, death is temporary. You die, you respawn, you try again. But Achlys represents the idea of permanent death, the final game over, the state from which there's no respawning. She's a reminder of real mortality in the midst of virtual immortality. In fantasy literature beyond Riordan, Achlys occasionally appears as a figure of primordial darkness, often in stories that delve into the deepest, oldest layers of mythological cosmology. She's useful for authors who want to suggest something that predates the familiar pantheons, something so ancient and fundamental that even the gods fear it. This use of Achlys connects to broader trends in contemporary fantasy toward exploring the darker, stranger corners of mythology. Modern fantasy readers are often looking for something beyond the standard Zeus and Hercules stories. They want the weird stuff, the primordial stuff, the figures that don't get Disney movies. Achlys fits that niche perfectly. There's also been interest in Achlys in certain philosophical and existentialist circles, particularly among those interested in phenomenology and death studies. Academic works examining the nature of dying, the subjective experience of mortality, sometimes reference Achlys as a mythological precedent for thinking about death as an experience rather than just an event. This academic interest treats Achlys seriously as a concept, not just as a character in stories. She represents an early attempt to articulate and personify the phenomenology of dying, and in that sense, she's relevant to contemporary discussions about death awareness, mortality salience, and the subjective dimensions of the dying process. In popular culture more broadly, the concept of the death mist, even if not explicitly connected to Achlys, appears frequently in visual media. Film and television depictions of death often show vision fading, the world becoming dim and distant, darkness closing in. This is such a standard visual language for depicting dying that we barely notice it, but it's essentially the same phenomenon the Greeks identified as Achlys. The modern filmmaker is, in a sense, invoking Achlys every time they show a character's vision fading as they die. There's also been some interest in Achlys within certain spiritual and occult communities, particularly those that draw on Greek and Hellenistic magical traditions. Some modern practitioners of Hellenic polytheism acknowledge Achlys as a deity worthy of respect, if not worship. They see her as a representation of necessary aspects of existence, of the shadow side of life that must be acknowledged even if it can't be celebrated. This revival of interest in Hellenistic religion, small as it is, represents an attempt to engage with these ancient concepts not just as literary or cultural artifacts, but as living spiritual realities. For these practitioners, Achlys isn't just a character in old stories. She's a force, a presence, something that still exists and still plays her role in the cosmic order. The name Achlys has also found its way into modern taxonomy. There's a genus of plants called Achlys, commonly known as vanilla leaf or deerfoot. These are small woodland plants found in western North America. They're named Achlys because of their appearance in winter. When the plant dies back, it leaves behind pale, skeleton-like remains that look rather ghostly and death-like. But there's an interesting twist. These plants are called sweet after death because their dried leaves smell pleasant, somewhat like vanilla. So even in botanical nomenclature, Achlys carries this dual quality of death and unexpected sweetness, horror and beauty intermingled. In art, particularly in darker or Gothic-influenced work, Achlys occasionally appears as a subject. Artists drawn to themes of mortality, suffering, and the macabre sometimes reference Hesiod's description, creating visual interpretations of the goddess. These artistic works range from faithful attempts to render Hesiod's description to more abstract, symbolic representations of misery and the death mist. What's interesting about these modern artistic interpretations is that they often emphasize the pathos of Achlys rather than just her horror. Modern audiences, perhaps more than ancient ones, are inclined to sympathize with figures of suffering. Achlys becomes not just a monster but a tragic figure, eternally trapped in her role, forever suffering, forever bringing suffering. There's a kind of empathy extended to her that might not have been present in the original Greek conception. This empathetic interpretation connects to broader trends in modern mythology and storytelling, where we're increasingly interested in the perspectives of traditional villains and monsters. We want to know their backstories, understand their motivations, see them as complex beings rather than simple sources of danger. Achlys, in this context, becomes a figure worthy of pity as much as fear. There's also been some crossover between Achlys and modern psychological concepts, particularly around depression and mental illness. The metaphor of a mist or fog descending over consciousness, obscuring clear thought and perception, is often used to describe depressive states. While probably not directly influenced by the ancient concept of Achlys, this language echoes her nature, the mist that clouds vision and brings suffering. Some modern writers and thinkers have explicitly drawn this connection, using Achlys as a mythological way to talk about mental health struggles. She becomes a personification not just of physical dying, but of psychological suffering, of the internal darkness that can descend over consciousness even while you're physically alive. This broader interpretation actually aligns well with Achlys' ancient role as the personification of misery in general, not just the death myth specifically. She was always about suffering, about the clouding that pain and sorrow bring. Modern applications of this concept to mental health are, in a sense, returning to that broader understanding. In terms of literary criticism and mythological studies, Achlys has been the subject of various academic papers and book chapters, usually in the context of discussions about primordial deities, death mythology, or the evolution of Greek religious concepts. Scholars have traced her appearances across different sources, analyzed the variations in her mythology, and considered what she tells us about Greek attitudes toward death and suffering. This academic attention has helped rescue Achlys from near-total obscurity. A generation or two ago, she was barely a footnote in discussions of Greek mythology. Now, thanks to scholarly interest and popular culture appearances, she's becoming more widely known and discussed. The modern fascination with Achlys, limited as it is, seems to stem from several factors. First, there's something appealing about obscure mythology. In an age where the major Greek gods have been done to death, literally and figuratively, in countless adaptations, a figure like Achlys offers something fresh, something most audiences haven't seen before. She's exotic in a way that Zeus or Athena can never be again. Second, Achlys represents something that modern culture is grappling with in new ways: how to think about and talk about death. We live in a death-denying culture in many ways, where mortality is hidden away, sanitized, medicalized. But there's also a counter-movement toward death awareness, toward accepting mortality as a natural part of life. Achlys, with her brutal honesty about death and suffering, speaks to this movement. Third, there's something in Achlys that resonates with contemporary existential anxieties. We live in an age of uncertainty, of climate crisis, of pandemic, of various forms of collective and individual anxiety. The figure of a primordial goddess of misery who existed before everything else feels, oddly, relevant. She's a way of articulating the sense that suffering is fundamental, that darkness is always present, that the mist is always waiting to descend. But modern interpretations of Achlys also tend to add something that wasn't necessarily present in the ancient sources: the possibility of resistance. In Riordan's books, Percy defeats Achlys, at least temporarily. In video games, players overcome her. Even in academic discussions, there's often an implicit question: how do we deal with the reality that Achlys represents? How do we live well despite knowing that suffering and death are inevitable? This emphasis on resistance and coping strategies is very modern. The ancient Greeks, for the most part, didn't think you could defeat death or avoid suffering. You could face them with courage and dignity, yes, but you couldn't overcome them. Modern interpretations, influenced by contemporary values around agency and empowerment, often want to give characters more ability to fight back against dark forces like Achlys. Whether this represents an improvement or a dilution of the original concept is debatable. On one hand, it makes the stories more dramatically satisfying and gives audiences hope. On the other hand, it might lose something of the existential weight that made Achlys meaningful in the first place. The whole point of Achlys was that she's inevitable, unavoidable, beyond human power to resist. Making her defeatable might make for better entertainment, but it changes what she represents. There's also been some interesting cross-cultural work comparing Achlys to similar figures in other mythologies. Various cultures have death mist or darkness of death concepts, and comparative mythology has explored how Achlys fits into this broader pattern. Is she unique to Greek culture, or is she expressing something universal about how humans experience dying? The comparative approach suggests that the death mist concept, while specifically Greek in its mythological expression as Achlys, is based on a universal human experience. People across cultures and throughout history have observed the clouding of eyes at death, the fading of vision, the descent of darkness. The Greeks personified this as a goddess, but the underlying phenomenon is cross-cultural and timeless. In popular psychology and self-help literature, which often draws on mythological imagery, Achlys occasionally appears as a symbol of depression, despair, or the dark night of the soul. Various authors have used her as a way to talk about confronting your deepest fears and darkest emotions. She becomes a challenge to be faced in the journey towards psychological wholeness. This therapeutic use of Achlys is quite far from her original context, but it demonstrates the adaptability of mythological symbols. Achlys can be reinterpreted for different purposes while still retaining something of her essential nature. She's about darkness, suffering, the things we'd rather not face, but must. In music, particularly in genres like death metal, black metal, and dark ambient, there have been occasional references to Achlys. Band names, song titles, album concepts, and lyrics sometimes draw on her imagery. The musical genres that explore themes of darkness, mortality, and suffering find in Achlys a perfect mythological reference point. These musical interpretations tend to emphasize the horror and power of Achlys, her ancient and terrifying nature. They're less interested in her as a pitiable figure and more interested in her as an embodiment of absolute darkness and misery. The growling vocals and distorted instruments of extreme metal genres attempt to sonically represent what Achlys represents mythologically. In role-playing games, both tabletop and digital, Achlys sometimes appears as a deity that characters can worship, encounter, or draw power from. In these contexts, she's often associated with death magic, poison, or effects that obscure vision or cause suffering. Game designers use her as a source of specific mechanical abilities that reflect her mythological nature. What's interesting about this gaming use of Achlys is that it requires players to actively engage with what she represents. If your character worships Achlys or draws on her power, you have to think about what that means, what it says about your character. You're not just reading about a death mist goddess in a book. You're actively incorporating her into your play experience. The internet age has also facilitated niche communities of people interested in obscure mythology. Online forums, wikis, and social media groups dedicated to Greek mythology often feature discussions about Achlys, with people sharing sources, interpretations, and creative works inspired by her. This has helped preserve and spread knowledge about even very obscure mythological figures. In these online communities, you'll find amateur scholars, creative writers, artists, and simply enthusiasts all engaging with Achlys in various ways. Some are interested in historical accuracy, trying to trace every ancient reference and understand exactly what the Greeks believed. Others are more interested in creative reinterpretation, using Achlys as inspiration for their own stories, art, or spiritual practices. This democratization of mythological knowledge is a very modern phenomenon. In the ancient world, knowledge of obscure deities like Achlys would have been limited to educated elites, priests, or specialists. Now, anyone with internet access can research Achlys, read the ancient sources, and form their own understanding and interpretations. Modern fiction has also occasionally used Achlys as a name for characters or entities, even when not directly referencing the Greek goddess. The name itself, with its unusual combination of consonants and its dark associations, has a certain appeal for fantasy and science fiction authors looking for evocative names. In these uses, Achlys might be the name of a villain, a dark planet, a mysterious organization, or any number of other shadowy entities. The name carries its connotations of darkness and misery, even for audiences who don't know the mythological source. Looking at modern interpretations of Achlys overall, we can see several patterns. First, there's a tendency to make her more active and agential than she perhaps was in the original sources. Modern audiences want their mythological figures to do things, to have plans and motivations, not just to be forces of nature. Second, there's often an emphasis on her as a figure of pathos as well as horror. Modern sensibilities incline towards sympathy even for monsters, and Achlys' eternal suffering makes her sympathetic despite her terrifying nature. Third, modern interpretations often try to find ways to overcome or transcend what Achlys represents, reflecting contemporary values around empowerment and agency. The ancient Greek acceptance of inevitable suffering and death is often replaced with a more modern insistence on the possibility of resistance. Fourth, Achlys is increasingly used as a symbol for psychological and emotional states, not just physical death. The death mist becomes a metaphor for depression, despair, trauma, or any state where consciousness is clouded and suffering is acute. These modern interpretations, diverse as they are, all demonstrate that Achlys remains relevant. She speaks to something in the human experience that transcends time and culture. Whether she's appearing in a young adult novel, a video game, an academic paper, or a death metal song, she's still serving her ancient function, giving form and name to suffering, making concrete the abstract reality of death and misery. And perhaps that's the most important thing about modern interpretations of Achlys. They prove that even a relatively obscure Greek goddess, even a figure who inspired no temples or worship, even a deity whose main appearance is in a description on a shield, can still be meaningful thousands of years later. Because what she represents, what she embodies, what she makes visible, is as true now as it was in ancient Greece. Suffering exists. Death comes. The mist descends. Achlys is still there, still doing her work, whether we call her a goddess or a biological process or a psychological state. She's still the darkness at the edge of vision, still the clouding that comes over dying eyes, still the misery that's woven into existence itself. Modern interpretations may soften her, may make her more sympathetic, may find ways to resist or overcome her, but they can't erase her. They can't make her irrelevant. Because as long as humans suffer and die, as long as consciousness fades and vision clouds, Achlys will be there. Ancient or modern, Greek or universal, goddess or metaphor, she endures. Now for something completely different, yet strangely appropriate. There's a genus of plants that bears Achlys' name, and the story of these plants, their characteristics, and why they ended up named after a goddess of death and misery, is fascinating in its own right. The genus Achlys contains two species of small, perennial woodland plants native to Western North America. The most common is Achlys triphylla, commonly known as vanilla leaf or deerfoot. The other species, Achlys californica, is similar but more restricted in range. These plants are found in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia down through Washington, Oregon, and into Northern California. Now, why would a modest woodland plant be named after the primordial goddess of the death mist? The answer lies in the plant's appearance, particularly in winter. Achlys triphylla grows from rhizomes, producing leaves that emerge singly on long stalks. Each leaf is divided into 3 fan-shaped leaflets, which is where the species name triphylla comes from. In spring and early summer, the plants are green and healthy, with small white flowers appearing on separate stalks. These flowers are interesting in themselves. They lack petals, consisting only of white stamens, giving them a delicate, almost ghostly appearance. But it's in autumn and winter that the plant earns its connection to the goddess of death. As the growing season ends, the leaves of Achlys die back, but they don't simply wither and fall. Instead, they turn pale, becoming almost white or bone-colored. The delicate structure of the leaves remains visible, but all the green life has drained away. What's left looks like a ghost of the plant, a pale skeleton of what it once was. These dead leaves often persist through the winter, standing in the forest like pale specters, like the bleached bones of plants. Walking through a winter forest where Achlys grows, you might see these ghostly white leaf skeletons scattered across the forest floor and think, yes, that's exactly the kind of thing you'd name after a death goddess. The image is particularly striking against the dark soil and green undergrowth of the Pacific Northwest rainforest. The pale, dead leaves stand out, almost glowing in the dim light that filters through the winter forest canopy. They look like they belong to a place of death and shadow, which in a sense, they do. They're marking the death of the growing season, the dormancy of winter, the time when life retreats and waits. But here's where it gets even more interesting and appropriate. These dead leaves smell good. When dried, the leaves of Achlys triphylla have a sweet, vanilla-like scent, which is why the plant is also called vanilla leaf. Native peoples of the Pacific Northwest used these dried leaves for their pleasant fragrance, placing them among clothes and possessions to impart a sweet smell. This creates a fascinating parallel with the goddess Achlys. The plant looks death-like, especially in its winter state, pale and skeletal and ghostly. But it smells sweet. There's beauty hidden within the death-like appearance. Pleasure concealed in what looks like mortality's leavings. Remember the poisonous flowers that Achlys created in the Nonus account? Beautiful blooms that concealed deadly poison? The plant Achlys does something similar but inverted, death-like appearance concealing pleasant fragrance. The botanical naming of this plant as Achlys was done by botanist David Donne in 1832. Donne was a Scottish botanist who specialized in North American plants and who was well-versed in classical literature. When he encountered descriptions of this plant and learned about its pale, skeleton-like appearance in winter, he clearly thought of the Greek goddess Achlys and found the connection appropriate. It's worth noting that Donne's choice was quite literary and erudite. Most plant names, especially in that era, were either descriptive, referring to physical characteristics, geographical, referring to where the plant was found, or honorary, named after a person. To name a plant after an obscure Greek goddess required both classical education and a certain poetic sensibility. The common name, deerfoot, refers to the shape of the leaves, which somewhat resemble a deer's hoof when viewed from certain angles. But vanilla leaf is more commonly used, emphasizing the pleasant smell over the visual appearance. This common name misses the connection to death and misery that the scientific name captures, but it's more practical for everyday use. The plant Achlys grows in specific ecological conditions, shaded, moist forests with rich soil. It's a plant of the understory, of the dim places beneath the canopy of the shadows. This too seems appropriate for something named after a goddess of darkness and mist. Achlys triphylla doesn't grow in open, sunny meadows. It grows in the shaded, quiet, dimly lit places of the forest. The plant has various traditional uses beyond its fragrant properties. Some Native American groups used it medicinally, though the specific uses varied between groups. The plant contains various compounds that might have therapeutic properties, though it's not widely used in modern herbalism. There's something deeply satisfying about the fact that this plant exists, bearing Achlys' name, growing in the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. It's a living reminder of the goddess, a botanical echo of an ancient myth. Every spring, when the plants grow green and vibrant, and every winter, when they turn pale and skeletal, they're enacting a little drama of life and death, of growth and decay. The vanilla leaf plant, in its seasonal cycle, embodies something that the goddess Achlys represents: the interpenetration of life and death, beauty and decay, pleasure and sorrow. Nothing is purely one thing or another. The ghostly white dead leaves smell sweet. The death-like appearance conceals pleasant properties. Even in endings, there's a kind of grace. For botanists and naturalists working in the Pacific Northwest, Achlys triphylla is a familiar sight. They might walk past it regularly, identify it in field guides, study its ecology and relationships with other forest species. And some of them, the ones with classical education or curiosity about plant names, might know about the goddess it's named after and appreciate the connection. There's also something appropriate about the fact that this plant is not rare or endangered or particularly special in botanical terms. It's common, widespread, ordinary in its habitat. Just as death is common and widespread and ordinary, so is the plant named for the death goddess. Achlys triphylla doesn't require special conditions or protection. It just grows quietly, in the shadows, turning pale in winter, coming back green in spring, reliable and persistent. The rhizomatous growth pattern of Achlys is also interesting. The plant spreads underground, sending up new leaves from the hidden rhizome system. Above ground, you see the individual leaves, but below ground, they're all connected. This could be read as another parallel to the goddess. The individual deaths we see are all connected to the same underlying reality, the same eternal force of mortality that links all endings. In botanical illustrations and photographs, Achlys triphylla is actually quite beautiful in a delicate, understated way. The fan-shaped leaflets have a pleasing symmetry. The white flowers, though small and lacking petals, have their own elegant simplicity. Even the pale winter leaves, skeletal as they are, have a kind of austere beauty. This beauty in death, this aesthetic appeal in what represents mortality, might be the deepest connection between the plant and the goddess. Achlys the goddess is horrifying, yes, but Hesiod's description of her is also compelling, memorable, powerful. There's an aesthetic dimension to even the most terrible things. The plant captures this. Yes, it looks like death in winter, but it's also visually striking, worth noticing, worth naming, worth remembering. For anyone who wants to connect with the mythology of Achlys in a tangible, physical way, Achlys triphylla offers that opportunity. If you live in or visit the Pacific Northwest, you can seek out this plant in the forests. You can see its green summer leaves and its pale winter skeleton. You can smell its sweet dried leaves. You can experience, in a small and safe way, the paradox that the plant embodies: death that's beautiful, decay that's fragrant, endings that have their own peculiar grace. And when you do, you're connecting not just with a plant, but with a mythological tradition thousands of years old. You're seeing something that a Scottish botanist in 1832 saw and thought worthy of naming after an ancient goddess. You're touching, however lightly, the same mysteries of life and death that the ancient Greeks contemplated when they spoke of Achlys. The plant is a reminder that mythology isn't just old stories in books. It's living, present, continuing to evolve and find new expressions. A goddess from ancient Greece lives on in the scientific name of a North American plant. The death mist manifests as vanilla leaf. The eternal becomes botanical. The mythological becomes taxonomical. And every year, in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, Achlys triphylla grows and dies back and grows again, keeping the name alive, keeping the connection present, keeping the memory of a forgotten goddess growing in the shadows, sweet after death, beautiful in decay, a living monument to the eternal reality of mortality and misery and the strange grace that can be found even there. So we've traveled from primordial chaos to botanical taxonomy, from Hesiod's terrifying shield to Rick Riordan's young adult fiction. We've examined Achlys from every angle, as primordial deity, as death mist, as daughter of night, as sister to the Carice, as Roman Caligo, as witch-like poisoner, as symbol and metaphor, as philosophical concept, and even as a plant name. Now, as we near the end of our journey, we need to ask, what is the legacy of Achlys? Why does she matter? What can this obscure goddess teach us? Let's start with the most obvious point. Achlys is not a major figure in Greek mythology. She appears in only a handful of ancient sources. She had no temples, received no worship, starred in no famous myths. By most measures of mythological importance, she should be a footnote, barely remembered, certainly not worth a deep investigation. And yet, here we are, still talking about her over 2,000 years later, still finding meaning in her, still seeing her reflected in plants and poems, in books and games, in academic papers and artistic works. So clearly, despite her obscurity, Achlys has a lasting impact. But what is it? First, Achlys represents something that many more famous deities do not: the unflinching acknowledgement of suffering as fundamental to existence. The Greek pantheon is full of gods representing various aspects of life and nature, many of them positive or at least neutral. But Achlys is purely negative. She's misery, suffering, death, and nothing else. She offers no comfort, no hope, no positive aspect to balance the negative. This radical negativity is part of her legacy. She stands as a reminder that not everything in existence can be pleasant, that suffering is real and unavoidable, that death comes to everyone, and it's not pretty when it does. This willingness to describe the unpleasant in detail, to make readers uncomfortable in service of truth, is an important literary legacy. Not everything should be prettified. Sometimes, the most powerful writing is the writing that makes you want to look away but compels you to keep reading anyway. Achlys's cosmological significance, particularly in those traditions that place her before chaos, represents another kind of legacy. She stands for the idea that darkness, suffering, and death might be more fundamental than light, joy, and life. This is a challenging, even disturbing philosophy, but it's one that's been influential in various philosophical and religious traditions throughout history. The idea that negation precedes affirmation, that absence comes before presence, that darkness is primary and light is derivative. These are deep philosophical concepts that Achlys, in her own way, embodies. Her legacy includes this contribution to cosmological thinking, this challenge to assumptions about what's primary and what's secondary in the nature of reality. In terms of religious and spiritual legacy, Achlys represents a certain kind of honesty about the divine. Not all gods are good. Not all divine forces are benevolent. Some aspects of reality, even divine reality, are simply terrible and must be accepted as such. Achlys can't be reformed, can't be converted to goodness, can't be made palatable. She is what she is, and that's not changing. This unflinching portrayal of negative divinity, of godhood that offers nothing positive to humanity, is part of Achlys's legacy. It's a reminder that the divine isn't necessarily on our side, isn't necessarily working for our benefit, isn't necessarily something we should worship or propitiate. Some divine forces simply exist, doing what they do, indifferent to human concerns. The legacy of Achlys also includes her contribution to the broader theme of feminine death goddesses in Greek mythology. She's part of a pattern, a tradition of personifying death and related phenomena as female. Whether this reflects ancient attitudes about women and death, about the feminine and transformation, or simply the grammatical gender of certain Greek words, it's a pattern that Achlys participates in and reinforces. This feminization of death has had lasting cultural impact, influencing how death is depicted and understood in Western culture. The Grim Reaper might be male in modern depictions, but the tradition of feminine death goddesses remains influential, particularly in more poetic or mythological contexts. Achlys' lasting impact can also be seen in how she's been adapted and reinterpreted over time. From ancient Greek poetry to Roman cosmogony, to Byzantine scholarly works to modern fantasy fiction, Achlys has proven adaptable. She can be cosmic or personal, abstract or vivid, pitiable or terrifying, depending on what each era and culture needs her to be. This adaptability is itself a kind of legacy. Good mythological symbols are flexible, capable of bearing multiple meanings, able to be reinterpreted for new contexts without losing their essential nature. Achlys has proven to be such a symbol. She's been the primordial darkness before creation and the personal experience of dying. She's been cosmic force and intimate presence. She's been all these things and more, demonstrating the enduring power of mythological thinking. For modern audiences, particularly those interested in mythology, death studies, philosophy, or literature, Achlys' legacy is about providing a different perspective, alternative way of thinking about death and suffering. In a culture that often tries to deny or hide death, Achlys forces confrontation. In an age that looks for positive meanings and silver linings, Achlys offers none. She's pure darkness, pure suffering, pure misery. And paradoxically, there's value in that. There's a kind of psychological and spiritual healthiness in acknowledging that not everything has a positive spin, that some things are just bad, and that's okay. Achlys teaches acceptance not of death itself. Death is inevitable whether you accept it or not, but acceptance of the truth about death. It's not beautiful. It's not noble. It's the mist descending over your eyes, and it's as horrible as it sounds. This radical acceptance, this unflinching acknowledgement of harsh truths, is perhaps Achlys' most important legacy for the modern world. We need figures like her, symbols that don't offer false comfort, deities that don't promise everything will be okay. Because sometimes everything won't be okay. Sometimes suffering is just suffering. Sometimes death is just death. And Achlys is there to remind us of that. Her legacy is also pedagogical. Through Achlys, we learn about Greek mythology's depth and complexity, about how the Greeks thought about death and suffering, about ancient cosmologies and phenomenologies. She's a window into a different worldview, a different way of organizing religious and philosophical thought. For scholars and students of ancient religion, Achlys represents the value of studying even obscure deities. She might not be as famous as Zeus or as well documented as Athena, but she reveals aspects of Greek religious thought that the major deities don't. She shows us what the Greeks feared, how they conceptualized dying, what they thought was fundamental to existence. That's valuable knowledge, worth preserving and studying. The artistic legacy of Achlys, particularly Hesiod's description on the shield of Heracles, has influenced countless artists, writers, and creators over the centuries. The image of the starving, bleeding, grinning goddess has been referenced, adapted, and reimagined in various media. It's become part of the visual vocabulary of horror, a way of depicting death and misery that's both specific and universal. Every time a modern artist depicts death as a grotesque, suffering figure rather than a serene one, they're drawing on a tradition that includes Achlys. Every time a writer describes the experience of dying with unflinching, visceral detail, they're following in Hesiod's footsteps. Achlys' artistic legacy is about the power and validity of depicting horror honestly. In philosophical terms, Achlys' legacy includes her contribution to discussions about the nature of suffering, the problem of evil, and the meaning of mortality. She doesn't solve these philosophical problems, she might make them worse, but she provides a mythological framework for thinking about them. She personifies questions that philosophy has been grappling with for millennia. Why does suffering exist? If Achlys existed before even chaos, then suffering is fundamental, not contingent. It's woven into the fabric of reality at the deepest level. This is a bleak answer, but it's an answer, and it has implications for how we think about suffering's meaning and our response to it. The legacy of Achlys also includes her role in military psychology and the aesthetics of warfare. The Shield of Heracles, with its prominent depiction of Achlys, represents an understanding that psychological warfare is as important as physical combat. The image of death and suffering can be weaponized, can be used to demoralize and intimidate enemies. This understanding has persisted throughout military history. Modern militaries still use psychological tactics, still try to project an image of overwhelming force and inevitable death. Heracles' shield, with Achlys emblazoned on it, is an early example of this tactical understanding. Finally, Achlys' legacy is about the endurance of mythology itself. Here's a goddess from ancient Greece, mentioned in only a few sources, never worshipped, never major, and yet she persists. She finds her way into modern books, modern games, modern discussions. She gets a plant named after her. She becomes a symbol that people still find meaningful. This persistence demonstrates that mythology isn't dead, that ancient symbols can still speak to us, that there's value in preserving and studying even the most obscure aspects of ancient religious thought. Achlys endures because she represents something true and universal: the reality of suffering, the inevitability of death, the mist that comes for all. As long as humans continue to suffer and die, as long as we're conscious beings aware of our own mortality, figures like Achlys will remain relevant. We might call her by different names, might understand her in different terms, might incorporate her into different cultural contexts. But the essential truth she represents doesn't change. The mist descends. The eyes cloud. The darkness comes. That's been true for as long as humans have existed, and it will remain true for as long as we continue to exist. Achlys is the name and face we've given to that truth, the mythological form we've created to contain and express it. And in that sense, her legacy is eternal. Not because she's famous or widely worshipped or dramatically important in mythological narratives, but because she represents something that will never stop being relevant. As long as there's death, there's Achlys. As long as there's suffering, there's the goddess of misery. As long as vision fades and consciousness dims, and the world slips away from dying eyes, there's the death mist. That's her legacy. That's her lasting impact. Not glory or fame or worship, but simple, terrible, unavoidable truth, personified and acknowledged and passed down through the ages. Achlys endures because what she represents cannot be escaped, cannot be defeated, cannot be made to go away. She is, as she has always been, eternal. We've spent hours together tonight, exploring every aspect of Achlys, the goddess of eternal night, the primordial misery, the death mist that descends over fading eyes. From the darkness before chaos to modern fantasy novels, from Hesiod's horrifying description to sweet-smelling vanilla leaf plants, from ancient Greek battlefields to contemporary discussions of mortality and meaning, we've traced her presence through mythology, literature, philosophy, and culture. What have we learned? What can we take away from this deep dive into one of mythology's most obscure and disturbing figures? First, we've learned that Achlys represents something essential and unavoidable about human existence. Suffering and death are real, are fundamental, and cannot be prettified or denied. The Greeks, by creating this goddess, by describing her in such visceral, uncomfortable detail, were demonstrating a kind of courage. They looked at the worst aspects of life and didn't flinch. They named them. They gave them form. They acknowledged their power. Second, we've learned about the phenomenology of dying, about how the ancients understood and described the subjective experience of death. The death mist, the Achlys that descended over dying eyes, wasn't just poetic imagery to them. It was a real phenomenon, worthy of personification, significant enough to be given divine status. This teaches us about the value of paying attention to subjective experience, to what things feel like, not just what they mean. Third, we've learned about the complex Greek attitudes toward fate, death, and mortality. The Greeks didn't have a single, simple view of death. They had multiple deities and concepts representing different aspects of dying and death. Achlys was one piece of this complex puzzle, representing the specific moment of transition, the experience of vision fading, the darkness descending. Fourth, we've learned about the enduring power of mythological symbols. Achlys, despite her obscurity, has persisted for over 2,000 years. She appears in ancient poetry and modern novels. She's referenced in philosophical discussions and painted in artworks. She's become a plant name and a character in video games. This persistence demonstrates that mythology isn't just ancient stories. It's a living tradition, constantly being reinterpreted and finding new expressions. Fifth, we've learned about honesty and acceptance. Achlys doesn't offer false comfort. She doesn't promise that death will be peaceful or meaningful or beautiful. She just shows us what death is: the mist descending, the vision clouding, the darkness coming. And there's value in that honesty, in that refusal to sugarcoat reality. Sometimes we need to face uncomfortable truths, and Achlys forces us to do exactly that. Sixth, we've learned that even suffering can have a kind of dignity, a kind of meaning, when it's acknowledged and named. Achlys herself is suffering personified. She's starving, bleeding, weeping eternally. She's as much a victim as an agent. But by giving her form, by making her a goddess, the Greeks were saying that suffering matters, that it's significant enough to deserve recognition and respect, even if we can't eliminate it. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, I want you to think about what Achlys means to you. Maybe she's just an interesting historical curiosity, a glimpse into how ancient people thought about death. Maybe she's a powerful symbol that resonates with your own experiences of loss or suffering. Maybe she's a reminder of mortality, a memento mori for the modern age. Maybe she's all of these things or none of them. But whatever she means to you personally, I hope this exploration has given you a deeper appreciation for the complexity and depth of Greek mythology, for the ways ancient cultures grappled with the same fundamental questions we still face today. How do we deal with suffering? How do we face death? What does it mean to be mortal? What's at the core of existence? The Greeks didn't have all the answers. Achlys is proof of that. She's a goddess who offers no solutions, no comfort, no hope. She just is. She simply exists, doing what she does, bringing the mist, marking the deaths, embodying the misery. But maybe in that honest acknowledgement of what can't be solved or fixed or improved, there's a kind of wisdom. Maybe we don't need to eliminate suffering to live well. Maybe we just need to acknowledge it, face it, name it. Maybe we don't need death to be beautiful or meaningful. Maybe we just need to accept that it's real and it's coming and the mist will descend, and that's okay. Not good, not something to celebrate, but okay. Acceptable. Part of the deal of being alive. Achlys teaches us that darkness is as real as light, that endings are as important as beginnings, that the shadow side of existence deserves recognition just as much as the bright side. She teaches us that the things we'd rather not think about, the realities we'd prefer to avoid, are sometimes the most important things to acknowledge and understand. And she teaches us that honesty, even brutal honesty, even honesty that offers no comfort, is valuable. It's better to face truth, however harsh, than to live in illusion, however pleasant. Achlys is harsh truth personified, and there's a strange kind of respect we can have for that, a recognition that sometimes we need figures who don't lie to us, who don't tell us what we want to hear. So here's to Achlys, the forgotten goddess, the death mist, the eternal misery. Here's to the obscure deity who never had a temple, but who represents something eternally true. Here's to the starving, bleeding, weeping goddess who stands at the threshold between life and death, marking every passage with her characteristic darkness. She's not a goddess anyone would choose to worship. She's not a figure anyone would want to encounter. But she's real as death itself, and she deserves to be remembered, to be studied, to be acknowledged for what she is. The darkness at the edge of all light, the shadow that follows all brightness, the mist that eventually descends over all eyes. When your time comes, as it will come for all of us, when you feel the world starting to slip away, when your vision begins to fade and the darkness starts to descend, you'll know her name. Achlys, the death mist, the eternal night, the goddess who was there before everything began and who will be there after everything ends. She's waiting. She's always waiting. Patient, eternal, inevitable. The mist that comes for all, the darkness that claims all sight, the final truth that no one can escape. That's Achlys. That's her story. That's her legacy. And now you know her too. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of mythology's darkest corners, if you appreciate explorations of obscure mythological figures and the profound truths they represent, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more content on myth, folklore, and the strange stories that humans have told themselves throughout history to make sense of existence. Share this with anyone who might appreciate a journey into darkness, anyone who's interested in Greek mythology, anyone who's willing to face uncomfortable truths about death and suffering. And let me know in the comments, had you heard of Achlys before? What do you think about her? Do you find her terrifying, tragic, both, or neither? What aspect of her mythology resonates most with you? I read all the comments, and I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts. Until next time, may your vision remain clear, may your suffering be bearable, and may the mist stay away from your eyes for many years yet. But when it comes, as it must, remember, there's a goddess for that moment. Her name is Achlys, and she's been waiting since before the beginning of time. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, even in the darkest nights, even in the deepest misery, even when the mist descends, you're not alone. Every human who has ever lived has faced the same darkness. We're all in this together, mortal and doomed and suffering, and yet somehow still here, still going, still finding meaning and beauty even in a universe where Achlys waits at the end of every road. That's the real lesson, perhaps. Not that suffering and death are inevitable, though they are, but that humans keep going anyway. We know Achlys is there. We know the mist is coming. We know we can't escape her. And yet we live. We create. We tell stories. We name our fears. We look into the face of death and say, I see you. I know you're there. And I'm going to live my life anyway. That's courage. That's heroism. Not avoiding Achlys, but acknowledging her and living fully despite knowing she's there. Not denying the mist, but seeing it clearly and choosing to act anyway. Not pretending suffering doesn't exist, but facing it honestly and finding meaning regardless. The ancient Greeks understood this. That's why they could create a goddess like Achlys, could describe her in such horrible detail, could put her on shields and mention her in poetry. They weren't denying death or pretending it wasn't terrible. They were looking at it squarely and living their lives anyway. We can learn from that. We can take inspiration from that ancient courage, that willingness to face the darkness without flinching. We can acknowledge that Achlys is real, that suffering is fundamental, that death is inevitable, and then we can go out and live our lives as fully and beautifully and meaningfully as possible anyway. Because in the end, that's all we can do. The mist will come eventually, but until it does, we have this moment, this breath, this day, this life, and maybe that's enough. Maybe it's not about escaping Achlys, but about living well in the time before she arrives. That's the final lesson of the goddess of eternal night. Not that darkness wins, though it always does in the end, but that light, brief as it is still worth celebrating. Life, temporary as it is, still matters. Vision, fleeting as it is precious precisely because it will fade. Cherish what you can see while you can see it. Live fully while you can live. Because the eternal night is coming. Achlys is waiting. The mist will descend. But not yet. Not today. Today, you're alive. Your eyes are clear. The world is visible. And that's something to appreciate, something to celebrate, something to make the most of. So go forth. Live well. Face the darkness when it comes with courage and honesty. And remember the lesson of Achlys, that even the most terrible truths can be faced, can be named, can be acknowledged without destroying us. We're mortal. We're suffering. We're doomed. And we're also magnificent, creating meaning and beauty and connection in the face of inevitable ending. That's the human story. That's the eternal struggle. That's what Achlys, in her terrible way, teaches us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into darkness. Until next time, be well, be brave, and remember, the mist may be eternal, but so is the light that shines before it arrives. Good night, and take care.